to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we're going to do our first in what I'm hoping will be a series of interviews and assessments using the It Culty website, where we invite somebody that comes from a background with some particular group, be it religious, political, hobby, or whatever, and then we just go through the It Culty assessment and try to learn from their experience as they reflect on each of the different tactics that are part of that It Culty assessment, so they can kind of give us a sense and some perspective on what these things may look like in various groups, and so that we can start to compare the degree of cultiness of people's experience in various groups. Now, today we have a treat because we're going to look at the Church of Scientology, and we have a phenomenal voice in the realm of people who are speaking out about the reality behind the facade of Scientology, and that is Chris Shelton. You can find him on YouTube if you just Google Chris Shelton. His channel's name is Critical Thinker at Large, and he's got just a phenomenal body of work exploring the background of Scientology, doing deep dives into the theology, the technology, everything about it. And you've seen him on my channel before discussing various aspects and kind of clashing heads at some point with some other guests. But without further ado, I want to invite Chris into our stream. There he is. Hey, Chris, how are you doing?
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Now, I don't know if your audio changed a little bit. Your mic is a little bit different than it was just a few moments ago. Okay, that's
sorry about that.
That's all right. So I came to you a few weeks ago. That's all right. I came to you a few weeks ago and kind of showed this tool to you, but this is kind of what I was really aiming for. I wanted to give a chance to have you go through this assessment so that you can kind of explore the question of, is it a cult, and do it in a little bit more direct way, because the question, is Scientology or is any other group a cult? It's kind of fraught. What's your take on that question? When you ask if something is a cult, what do you think?
Yeah, my biggest problem with that question is that it is so commonly misunderstood. Everybody's got these different ideas about what a cult is. And so it's really important at the get-go to clarify that. But of course, under almost any definition of the word, Scientology is a cult. And I will go further and say it is a destructive cult. It is a group of people who are very, very passionate, very, very extreme in their ideas and their belief set. And because of that passion and that extremism, they justify or are able to easily rationalize some pretty awful and abusive behavior. And that's where, we have a problem with what the group is doing. It's not about, their beliefs or their ideas and how stupid or silly or goofy or how much I disagree with them. It's about what they do. And that's the thing I want to say right from the get-go. When I talk about cults or destructive cults, I'm talking about actions, not words.
Yeah. And that distinction is so important because, when you think about all the different groups that have carried the label cult in the public mind, you have something that is I come from a background of Mormonism, and most people, when they look at Mormons today, they say, well, these are polite people. They're nice. Yeah, some people call them a cult, but usually those are just the angry evangelicals that are just trying to save them from hell. But then they're, labeled a cult in some context. But then also you have groups like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, places where mass suicide, or even the Japanese cult that resulted in the ricin poisonings or the gassing in the subway system in Japan. There's just like such a broad spectrum of the degree of damage.
That's right. And yeah, to be clear, you can be superficially nice and polite and very, 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 very nice. You can kill people with kindness, right? I mean, you can really go that direction. And so I want to be clear that the actions that we talk about with destructive cults are not always out in the open. And sometimes they are behind closed doors. They are in closets. They are in closed rooms. They are in churches. They are in basements. They are in other places that are not so obvious. So that's, so a good public front, is of great benefit to a destructive cult, right? Because then people back away and, oh no, they would never, ever do that, kind of thing. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to get into the nitty and the gritty of this assessment, because the question, is it a cult, is just kind of a big blanket thing. But when you say, okay, well, wait a second, what do cults do? Let's look at, the different things that researchers, sociologists, people who have studied these groups have said, hey, wait, this is the thing that all these groups seem to have in common about how they, what's called brainwashing or undue influence, or how they, strongly overwhelm the cognitive apparatus of their members so that they go along with things they would otherwise not go through. Let's look at each of those things and then just ask ourselves, is this present in the group, and to what degree it is? And once you do that with these 40 different things, you really get a much more detailed and specific way to describe, no, it's not just that it's cult, it's that it is culty, and it's culty to this degree, and I'll tell you why. But before we get to that, the first thing we got to do is we got to ask, well, what does Scientology itself say about this question? Because everyone's like, oh, Scientology is a cult. Well, they have a page on their website that answers it. So we can just go to the source and find out.
Right.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Have you seen this page before? I got to imagine that you have.
Of course I have. Yes.
Okay, so let's see here. Is Scientology a cult? No. It is a religion in the fullest sense of the word. Cult is usually meant in a disparaging sense to imply a secret or closed group with limited membership and mysterious beliefs. Religious scholars point out that the term has become almost meaningless, since its modern usage reflects a growing prejudice against all religions. For example, a government report in Belgium labeled Hasidic Jews and even the YWCA as cults. French Parliament included Baptists on their list. What do you think so far? They're not wrong.
I think that they are engaging in incredibly crafty wordplay here. That's what I think. Because every one of these statements is both true and false at the same time. This is sort of Schrodinger's assessment of cults.
I love that. Okay, so it's pretty short. Religions that grow and endure do so to the degree they assist people in their spiritual lives. To fulfill this role, the scripture of Scientology is fully codified, broadly published, and available to anyone. Furthermore, its churches and missions are always open to the public. Scientology is unique in that it does not. Scientology is unique in that it doesn't force anyone to believe anything. Rather, Scientology maintains every individual should think for themselves. In Scientology, what is true for the individual is not only what they have observed personally what's true for the individual is only what they have observed personally and know is true for them. Scientology is not authoritarian, but instead offers a technology one can use and then decide whether it works for them.
Right. Well, I will definitely take exception with the point there where that last sentence where they say Scientology is not authoritarian. It most definitely is. Scientology relies on a single authority figure, L. Ron Hubbard, and makes no bones about that. It's very, very clear. So L. Ron Hubbard, in fact, it was kind of funny when you said, let's go to the source, because L. Ron Hubbard is labeled, one of the titles that he has in Scientology is the word source. He is capital S, source, right? So when he is source, that means you cannot contradict him or, in any way say, well, he got that one wrong.
Right.
I think that you're just going to get a pass, and Scientology doesn't work that way.
I just think it's hilarious that, they're like, no, we're not a cult. And then the little pop-up at the bottom is get to know the real you, which kind of just goes into that thing where these groups that are destructive cults, they want to subvert your sense of identity and your sense of self and claim that they have access or can give you access to who you really are. And it's that subversion of your own identity, which is how they get the hooks in you. Exactly. And so it's right on the same page.
That's right. Of course it is.
Okay.
Of course it is. And that's a really good point you make, because, it needs to be said out loud. I think way more often, and I should probably be doing this on my channel too, of, you know who you are. There's no mystery to you, who you know yourself better than anyone is ever going to know you. There is no mystery to who you are to yourself. And it's actually the installation of that idea that is one of the hooks, one of the first little, like, wait a minute, there's something more to know? Like, what? And it's like, well, sure, of course, there's a lot of things to know about yourself, but there's no mystery, that
Yeah.
there's no secret, being or creature or something buried deep within you that you need to do something about. It's so funny the way, like, right from the get-go, they're setting this up for
Yep,
you.
it's right there.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I'd say that the experience is different if you've been converted into one of these religious ideologies that does try to subvert your identity versus when you're born into it. When you're born into it, it's the air you breathe at the beginning. And so the discovery that what you thought your identity was a little bit of a mythological story and not actually rooted in any objective reality, that's its own journey in and of itself. So getting to know what's real and what's not real is an important part of that. So with
Right.
that foundation laid, we know that Scientology considers itself it kind of says, well, the word cult can apply to anything. So we're just, we're not the bad religion, we're a good religion.
Right.
And so I always like to do this before we start this assessment. If you were to guess on a scale of 1 to 10 how high Scientology is going to rate as a cult, we'll look at the percentage at the end of the time. What would you guess it was going to be?
I'll guess that it's going to come out in the 8 or 9 band.
Okay. All right. Well, that gives us a good baseline, a good kind of pre-test assessment. Okay. So I'm going to bring up the website. If any of the viewers would like to check up on this for themselves, they can go to the website isitculty.com. And if you pull up that website, you're going to be presented with this page. I always like to start just to set the tone for this assessment by reading the introduction. Am I in a cult? This question is tough. Of course, people in healthy groups will answer no because, well, that's true. But even people in some of the most damaging cults will also answer with an emphatic no. This is because cults interfere with your agency and identity and distort the very mental processes which would be necessary to see them for what they are. What is a cult? Well, it turns out that the descriptor cult just isn't very helpful for reflecting on your own experience. A better way to assess this question is to identify the deceptive and manipulative methods that cults use and to ask yourself if your group also uses such culty methods and to what extent. This website is a tool to help you do just that. The assessment. Is it culty? The assessment looks at 4 different methods of control used by cults, divided into 4 areas of control: behavior, information, thought, and emotion. You're going to enter some basic information and then rank the frequency or intensity that you experience each of the different culty tactics while in the group. The resulting culty score is a subjective index of how intensely you experienced culty dynamics in the group. But my group isn't a religion. Culty groups aren't just fringe religions. There have been controlling, unhealthy groups found in social clubs, political movements, self-help groups, personal relationships, and internet discussion forums. People under the influence of such groups lose objectivity and may not see the group for what it is. If your relationship with a group or person is culty, it will tend to shift personal agency and cognition away from you and to the group or person in control while exploiting very human psychological vulnerabilities that we all possess. No claims about God are required. Now, no one may have a good answer for the question, is my group a cult? But this tool will help you answer a more useful question. Is it culty? If you're ready to examine your own experience in the group, click the button below to begin. All right, so let's dive in. I'm going to just verify that I'm not a robot, and we will begin our assessment. Okay, so first thing that we're going to do, and I'm going to let you kind of give me all the feedback for all these things, is give some background to ourselves, to you for the group. So what type of group are you assessing? We have religion, political, business, professional, etc. We're going to choose religion.
Yep.
What's the name of the group? We'll say Scientology. What is your current membership status? Current member, former member, or outside observer?
Former member, of course.
All right. And what was your level of commitment? Not at all, mildly committed, moderately, mostly, or absolutely committed?
I would say I was absolutely committed.
All right. How many years were you involved? Less than a year, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30?
Let's say 20 to 30.
Or 30 to 50 if it was even more than that.
Well, it was
Okay.
more. So it was 30 to 50. Because since I was from 4 until I got out when I was 42.
Oh, oof. All right.
Yeah.
How would you describe your experience? Mostly negative, equally positive and negative, mostly positive, or all positive? Or all negative?
I'd say mostly negative.
Okay. All right. Now, on to the assessment. Okay. So if you're going through this at home, you can kind of look at this full page and go through all the ones. I have a special carousel mode that we're going to use here for the purpose of this presentation. All right. First one, relational control. The group dictates who the member can associate with, including who the member considers to be friends, families, or even sexual partners. All relationships are subject to the judgment of the group, and no relationship is higher in priority than the relationship of the member to the group itself. What do you think?
Yeah, that's definitely true in Scientology, no question about it. And I would say severe because they reserve the right to ultimately decide who you can and cannot be connected with as to whether that's going to continue your membership in the church. In other words, if somebody you know starts becoming publicly or openly critical of the church, or is, you know, kind of negative or critical of it, then the church membership, you might find yourself in a meeting or in a room where you are being told that because this person is doing that, regardless of anything else in their life, you know, this person could be a I don't know, a saint. You know, it could be Mr. Roger. Who knows, right? Regardless of any of that, just because they are critical of or criticizing Scientology, you must sever ties with that person or face consequences. So I would say that's a fairly severe form of relational control right there.
So shunning would fall in this category, or the way that that's expressed in, as I've heard you talk about before, is the suppressive person doctrine or technique that is a strong part of that. And certainly Leah Remini's series about the aftermath has some pretty powerful examples of that too.
Big time.
All right, so let's go back to this assessment, and we're going to go ahead and put that as severe then. All right, next, time control. The member has little time or energy to question beliefs, associate with outsiders, or examine life too closely. Time spent on group-related activities is strongly encouraged or enforced and usually fills every spare moment.
Yeah, this is now I'm going to have to draw a couple lines here in terms of how we're doing this, because there's my experience personally, and then there is the general experience of Scientology, because not everybody had the same experience I did, but everybody has varying degrees of time control constraints placed on them in Scientology. There's no one.
This is actually a good point. I want to make this for you as well as for anyone else that does this test. What you're reflecting on is your personal experience, because just as you're alluding to, people will have different experiences based on, you know, the leader that's in charge of the local interface that they actually have with the group, or even at what moment in time they are a part of a group. For example, in my case of Mormonism, a Mormon living in the early 1900s is going to have a very different experience in how much of a footprint in your life they have than today. So I don't want you to try to make it like you're pronouncing judgment on somebody else's experience in the group as you believe it might be. Just reflect on your own. So if you just, because I know your history is with some of the most intense corners of the group, then make it reflect your history itself. Does that make sense?
Totally.
All right. Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, good. So in that case, then it would be, you know, at the extreme end, because my time was extremely controlled. I mean, down to the second in many cases. So
what was the aspect of your interface with the group that was the most time controlling? What chapter of your life there?
Oh, well, that would have probably been the RPF. That was 3 years where I was in basically a kind of a prison re-education camp situation. And that's not hyperbolic. I was literally locked up, sequestered away, you know, from the rest of the group, and with a small group of people called the Rehabilitation Project Force. And I spent 3 years there getting my head straight, as they would say. It's really, like I said, it's very, very analogous to a Chinese or North Korean re-education camp. And you can read about these things in the work of Robert J. Lifton, who did actual academic study of that. So I make that comparison, you know, advisedly. You know what I mean? I'm not just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
There wasn't, you know, there weren't physical torture. You weren't tied up to a wall and tortured, but the psychological and physical, you know, demands on us during that period were if I started describing it at all, everybody would like lose their minds. It was extremely debilitating time period.
For the purpose of this particular question, though, it's kind of like how much control over what you spent your time on did you have personally to do things that were your own priorities versus the time that maybe you were expected or instructed or required to do for the group's priorities?
Right. Well, in that case, the answer was it was 100% group, right? I mean, it was 99% group, you could say. I mean, certainly during that time period, there was no personal time. I mean, almost literally none over that time period. There were no holidays. There were no days off. There was no time off. There was 20 minutes for lunch, 20 minutes for dinner. Literally, right? And this was accounted for on a schedule that was run, you know, on a stopwatch. So this was not there was no slacking off, right? And if you were found standing around or something and not working, because this is a work program, then you were made to drop and give me 20, right? Like push-ups, running around the block, go take a lap. You know, it was a very physically grueling program.
So there's a punitive dynamic to it too.
Yeah.
But now, if you were to look at the landscape of your time with Scientology, what was, because I imagine you were in the position of just a conventional member that hadn't gone to some of these more extreme segments at one point. If you were reflecting on your time when you were a conventional member, how would you describe the footprint of the time control in your life at that point?
Sure. Well, when I very, very, very first started with the first courses that I was doing, the classwork that I started when I was 15 years old, I was still in high school, right? So I was going to school, and then I was going down to the church in Santa Barbara 15 hours a week. So it was all day Sunday, I think. And then it was like Monday night and Tuesday night and Wednesday night, something like that. I was driving back and forth to the classwork, and you had to put in 15 hours a week. It wasn't presented as an option of, well, would you like to? It was, no, this is the schedule, figure it out. Right. And so that's what I was made to do. And that was day one. As I progressed 2 years later, after I graduated high school, I started working for the church. They recruited me. And so then it was a 40-hour work week, but really it was more like a 70-hour work week is kind of how it went. Right. And then I was forced eventually to get another job full time so that I could pay for an apartment and have a place to live, because Scientology was paying me about $25 a week. So I couldn't live on that. And this was my first out of home experience, right? So my parents were basically subsidizing my existence for the first year. But that was, nominally 40 hours, but the pressure and the demands were, no, you got to be here as often as you can. Yeah. And it really equated out to about 60 to 70 hours a week. So pretty intense time demand. Yeah. That went for 8 years. Then I joined the Sea organization. So,
and then it went into overdrive. Yeah. One of the things they describe on this is that the amount of time that's expected or demanded of you it basically fills up any gaps where you could be exploring other ways of thinking, meeting with people who do think differently that might open the door to other existences and maybe cause you to doubt or to see a ray of light outside of existence within the group. Did you find that was an important or an aspect of the degree of time control?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, definitely. They don't want you distracted or off doing other things. Hubbard, in fact, wrote policies for the church, and one of them talked about people, Scientologists specifically, who find time for hobbies or other activities. And he derided them. He called them dilettantes. There's a word, that's the word they use in Scientology. It's a dirty word. Oh, you're a dilettante. You're somebody who only part-time Scientologist. You're one of those fringy you're only kind of interested in it. You don't really take it seriously. You're dabbling. And this is a kind of an insult in that world, right? So so there's a lot of pressure being put on even public members to constantly be down at the church. And this, of course, is reflective of the fact that there is mental conditioning, I'll say, occurring in Scientology, which needs constant watering. It needs constant reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why these groups will do this. And Scientology is definitely up there on that.
All right. So I'm going to say then the choice of none, mild, moderate, intense, or severe. We're going to go with severe.
Yeah. Yeah. From my experience, that's absolutely true.
Okay, next, demand for purity or perpetual inadequacy. Lofty moral goals are set. At first, the goals may seem achievable, but the standards for achievement grow ever more impossible to meet, keeping the follower perpetually inadequate.
Yeah. Yeah, this was definitely severe as well. Now, this, from my experience, was being a staff member and then a Sea Org member. This is where this really came into play. I would say at the public level, it wasn't quite as intense. I was a public person for a couple of years, right, just doing my coursework, and there wasn't quite as tight an iron grip on every part of my existence. But once you become a staff member and of course Sea Org, excuse me, you are there is a great deal of control exerted in Scientology through morality. You know, like you cannot masturbate, for example. This is an immoral act in Scientology and is treated as such, and you are disciplined if this comes up. And Scientology is a very invasive religion. It is a group of people who are very interested in every aspect of your private life. In fact, you know, in a word, you really don't have a private life because you are expected to be completely transparent with the church authorities when you are asked questions. They have forms you fill out that are very invasive, and this is then used to control your behavior, right? You cannot do this, you cannot do that. This is immoral, that is immoral. And a lot of the control in Scientology is exerted through moral codes and moral policing.
All right. And it sounds like, if it's anything like my experience in Mormonism, that strong moral code ends up internalizing your own sense of who you are, your own personal worthiness. Because even if you're not being interviewed, or if you're getting interviewed and you're lying, you are still judging yourself because you've been provided those standards of what is worthy, what is unworthy. And you know that you are impure because you haven't met the lofty standards that they have for it. And that message then turns on its head. If you do end up doubting or leaving, then the finger always gets pointed to you and your impurity as part of that reason.
That's right. That's exactly right. And also one little point to throw in here, just as a little awful spin on this kind of thing, is there in the description there, it talked about how these were like unrealistic or unachievable expectations, but you keep putting yourself there. That's very, very true here because there are what are called double binds littered throughout Scientology.
Oh, we're going to get to the double bind. That's one of these here because that you're absolutely right. It's related, but the double bind is kind of its own little specific thing, and we'll definitely get to that. Right. All right. So demand for purity, then, you're going to say is severe as well.
I will. For my experience, it absolutely was. This was an incredibly controlling point for and this is lifted straight out of Lifton, by the way, that academic psychologist.
That description of it.
Yeah.
So the other thing, because sometimes I've had some feedback on this where sometimes people are saying, well, when I'm answering these questions, I don't really know how to understand if that was a part of my life. And so sometimes the way you can look at these is just say, okay, well, just ask yourself, what would have happened if you didn't live up to any of these things that we're talking about? And when you see how those consequences affect your life, not through the natural result of those consequences, but because of what the group and its ideology have done to you, then that gives you a sense of how severe it was. If you would feel completely worthless or broken for not doing everything that the group expected of you, then that is a symptom of this demand for purity and perpetual inadequacy. If you always feel like you could be doing more, you're just not doing enough, well, then that's part of the effect of this type of thing.
Yep.
All right. So material control. The group dictates the material choices of the member. Food or drink may be strictly regulated. Clothing, hairstyle, makeup, or physical possessions may be either forbidden or prescribed by the group.
Yep.
What do you think? It kind of controls your physical environment or even your appearance.
Yeah, very much so. And again, for my experience personally, it was severe. For your run-of-the-mill Scientologists, they might have less of a demand on them in terms of appearance and such. But for example, as a staff member and a Sea Org member, which was the bulk of my experience, I worked for the church. So that's 25 years out of that time period we're talking about. So the demands on me during that time were very, very severe in terms of clothes I could wear, couldn't wear, appearance I could have and not have, right? Tats or earrings and things like that. Long hair, even at certain points, right? Especially in the Sea Org, hippies in the Sea Org, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Of course, in the Sea Org, we were uniformed. I mean, you couldn't just run around in clothes you wanted to wear. And so I was, every day, 7 days a week for about 17 years. I mean, almost every single day, it was button up collar and tie. And I haven't worn a tie since I got out.
Well, I think a lot of people would look at that and they'd say, well, the military also has regimented uniforms. And so, you can't really use that. You were an employee of the group. Of course, they're going to, you go to Taco Bell and they have a uniform. And that's where, this is reflecting your experience in the broadest part of your time with Scientology. If you were to reflect on how Scientology to its general lay membership, how much freedom do general Scientologists have to eat what they want, to dress how they want, or to have tattoos or earrings or anything?
Yeah. Okay. So even there, it's restricted because, like, for example, you cannot have aspirin, medicine, medications without approval through the church. That's policy of the church. And I mean, even aspirins or Tylenol, like you got to clear it. And you cannot drink alcohol within 24 hours of going into class or going into their auditing sessions. Their equivalency to counseling, I guess you could say. So that's regulated. You can't just drink. There are no drugs, no drug use, period, illegal or otherwise. So even where pot has been legalized or acid or shrooms has been decriminalized, Scientology doesn't care. You must not ever take any drugs, and you must not ever take any medications without the approval of the church. And that's everybody. So that's pretty regulated, And as far as the point about uniforms and stuff with the military and all that, same thing. I mean, the military is enforcing a code there, right? And so to that degree, it is restricting your behavior. Just because everybody agrees to it doesn't mean they're not restricting your behavior.
And to that point, with all of these 40 things, you're going to find some element of each of these different methods or tactics in relationships that are healthy and normal, because we all give a little bit of ourselves in the social interactions that we have with other people, with groups. And so the question here is when it goes to the extreme, or when it causes you to betray yourself in order to surrender that to the group. That's where we start crossing the line into some of the extremes. And that's what's useful to kind of hear the spectrum from the harmful to the kind of typical. All right. So going back to our answer here, material control for your experience, or how are we going to mark it?
I mean, for me, I'm going to say, I'll say intense. I'll put it down on the second to last on that one.
All right. This one's a little tricky. Imposed dependency. A member comes to depend on the group for physical, emotional, social, spiritual, or other needs. The member has a high stake in continuing to stay loyal to the group. So they kind of infantilize you, kind of take your sense of being able to be firm about your own thoughts, your own choices, unless you've checked with the group. Does that make sense?
That's right. I will definitely say severe on this one, and I will actually quote Hubbard as to why, if I can find this really fast. There is a policy letter in Scientology called Keeping Scientology Working. And there are some real choice quotes from this one. So let me see if I can dig this up real fast. This will just, here it is. Let me just This policy letter is the business, Hubbard says here, is the business of every staff member to enforce. Violations of it have threatened the viability of Scientology and orgs. That Scientology calls their churches orgs for organizations. They don't call them churches. Scientology will keep working only as long as you do your part to keep it working by applying this policy letter. And he says here, the road to Scientology's success is assured if the technology, the methods of Scientology are applied. And at the end, he says, after giving lots of examples of how if you screw it up, you're dooming the universe to a slow and painful death. When somebody enrolls, consider he or she has joined up for the duration of the universe. Never permit an open-minded approach. If they're going to quit, let them quit fast. If they're enrolled, they're aboard. And if they're aboard, they're here on the same terms as the rest of us. Win or die in the attempt. Never let them be half-minded about being Scientologists. The finest organizations in history have been tough, dedicated organizations. Not one namby-pamby bunch of panty-waist dilettantes have ever made anything. It's a tough universe. The social veneer makes it seem mild, but only the tigers survive, and even they have a hard time. So he goes on and on and on with this. But the point being there, of course, right, when you mention infantilizing somebody or making somebody, you know, too dependent on this, when you put it in terms like that, win or die in the attempt, right? This don't be half-minded. It's imbuing an intense degree of loyalty, because if Scientology doesn't make it, we're all dead, and dead forever. Not just dead this lifetime, dead for every lifetime into the future. So I'd say, yeah, that instills a mindset of ultimate dependency on Scientology.
Yeah.
And
when the stakes are so high, then you end up having to make sure you're getting it right. And if you're new to it, you don't know everything yet, but you have to get it right. So you have to continually turn to the leaders to say, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? And that relationship that develops is one of dependency rather than autonomy.
Big time. Exactly. Because that's how these words are interpreted and used, is to create more dependency, not less. If Scientology doesn't make it, you're personally for it. And so is everybody else. So we better get everybody on board. And by the way, we don't have any infinity of time to get the job done. He goes on to that later on in the policy.
So there's that urgency as well as the fear induction to try to get you to be more dependent on that. And we're going to see phobia induction as a later item, but it's an allusion to the fact that many of these things are interrelated, where things like guilt and shame and fear are all used to affect some of these other aspects. So we're definitely seeing that here. Okay, so for our score for imposed dependency,
severe.
What do you say?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. And it calculatedly so, you know, like that's definitely purposeful.
Well, and that may be also related to this next one, destabilization. Barriers are torn down that would otherwise prevent acceptance of new beliefs, including those who have already been destabilized by life situations and the indoctrination of children who have not yet formed a sense of self. So there's two aspects of this. One of them is where the teachings or doctrine actually cause you to kind of destabilize your sense of integrity, your sense of self, leaving you open to new ideas and new ways of thinking. Or they're going out and specifically targeting people who, through a death in the family or a new life situation, going off to college, leaving your family for the first time, have put you in a vulnerable situation where you may be more likely to take on a new identity or new way of thinking, if that makes sense. So it's employing it in either of these two ways.
Yeah. And I would say,
what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Scientology does both of these. And again, in a calculated, premeditated way. This is not an accident, and it's not just some organic thing that just happens. It's a strategic thing that Scientology is doing to its membership, is breaking down their ability to be independent thinkers or critical thinkers and replacing that that personality with L. Ron Hubbard's ideas and personality. This is for example, this might seem like a light thing. You got to appreciate that in the world of Scientology, it's a bit of a bubble world, and information is not free flowing in and out of this bubble. So when you're in this bubble, and the way they kind of push you into it harder and harder is by making you, for example, solve problems that you might have by asking yourself, well, what would Ron do? What would Hubbard do here in this situation? And then imagining, oh, well, he would do XYZ because he wrote this here or he said this here. And then adjusting your thinking and your solutions in your life around how L. Ron Hubbard would have dealt with it, rather than how you feel you might want to deal with it. This is a constant refrain in Scientology, amongst many, many others, that sort of lock you into solving things only with Scientology, and eschewing or actually rejecting other ways of thinking about a problem or looking at a situation.
You know, listening to you talk on various subjects before, the thing that comes to mind immediately when I read this is this idea that the auditing sessions are going to tell you how you are influenced negatively by thetans and by certain ideas. And that messaging, if you internalize it, you start to see yourself as flawed, which creates both a dependency dynamic on them, but also kind of denigrates your own sense of self and your self-integration. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. The auditing process or procedure in Scientology is not counseling. It is Euphoria induction. It's trance induction leading to creating a euphoric experience for the person. And as long as that's accomplished and the sessions are continued for, I've seen 10-hour sessions, 12-hour sessions where we're just gonna keep going until you get this, end phenomena is what they call it in Scientology, this EP. They love their abbreviations in Scientology. There's hundreds of them. And so you have to keep running the process or doing the procedure until you get to this EP. And that means you can't leave the room unless the auditor lets you leave the room. It's that kind of a situation. You're not in control. And so you quickly learn how to, kind of like figure out how you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do. And it's a very, very twisted, kind of scenario, because it's all given under this banner of therapy or counseling, and it's not that at all.
How do they start that in terms, before you get to the Euphoria induction?
Yeah.
What is the thing they tell you that that is wrong with you that they are solving, I guess?
Well, this is exactly the trick, and it's how they get you into that room in the first place, and get you to agree to endure this kind of abusive counseling. Is they preset you up with this indoctrination that you have something in your mind. A whole section of your mind is called the reactive mind. This is a fantasy. This is another fantasy of how the mind works. And in this reactive mind is contained all of the stress and trauma and pain and unconsciousness of your life. And so what we have to do is we have to go in there and roto-rooter this stuff out. And this is what the auditing is all about, is we're going to go in there and you're going to remember, your past trauma, including going back into your past lives. By the way, this is not just this lifetime thing. This is considered a religious/spiritual activity, not a scientific one, even though it's couched in all the words and flavor of science. And so this indoctrination sets you up to believe that there, like Freudian psychoanalysis, there's this evil id, which is just bullshit. There's no such thing. But in Scientology, it's this evil reactive mind, right? And we're going to erase it. And you're going to go into these sessions, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be rough. It's going to be tough, because the reactive mind is fighting for its survival, and it's fighting to exist. And so you're gonna go bump heads with this thing, and it's going to fight. And its ability to fight is to turn on within you sleep, unconsciousness, trance states, a pain, discomfort, like all this horrible stuff that's going to happen to you in the auditing session. It's just your reactive mind. See? And so this is the explanation that's given. So you're kind of set up to go into this session and go, okay, I'm going into battle with my reactive mind, and it's me and the auditor, and we're going to duke it out with this reactive mind. See? And so you're set up with this completely false construction, this mental fantasy. And then you're told that it's part of you. And it's this deep subconscious, unconscious mind that is always awake. Actually, Hubbard says it's always operating, but below your level of awareness. So you're not conscious of it or what it's doing to you. And this, of course, is the setup, as we mentioned earlier, of you can't really trust yourself. See? You don't really know yourself. You don't really know what's going on in your own head, in your own brain. We do. And we're the ones who are going to straighten things out for you, because poor you doesn't, it's so bad, you can't even be aware of how bad you are, how bad off you are. See? So it's a good thing. It's sure a lucky thing you stumbled in here, and we're here to help you, at, $800 an hour.
Yeah. That was such a spot on description of what I think they're trying to get out here in terms of tearing down your barriers, tearing down your sense of self-integrity or trust in yourself, so that you're open to this new form of indoctrination. That's pretty powerful. What about the aspect of, in proselytizing efforts, do they target people in vulnerable parts of their lives? And where do you see that manifest?
Yeah, big time they do. Of course, I was targeted when I was in high school. And I'm going to say it, as a 15-year-old nerd, I was vulnerable, right? I mean, we all are. And this is the point, is we are in vulnerable states in all kinds of places in our life. And, and everybody's kind of different. So we all have different reactions to different stressors. Some people can deal with physical stress really well. Other people can't. Some people can deal with mental stress really well. Others can't. And sometimes you run into situations where both of them are hitting you hard, and you're kind of down for the count and you need some help. And when that help comes in the form of Scientology, that help is quickly going to become betrayal. But, you don't see that when you need a helping hand. You reach out for it.
Yeah, no. And, I've heard you talk before about the front groups that Scientology has. So you may have some group that's targeting people whose lives have been decimated by substance abuse. And so they come in employing methods that may have some effectiveness that aren't really tied necessarily to Scientology, but it's the way that they insert themselves in your lives. And then the message that leads you to that later comes. Is that a pattern that you see happen?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. That's the purpose of those front groups, is to get people into Scientology. So they have drug rehab, they have mentoring and learning and illiteracy programs. There's a group called Criminon that goes into prisons and tries to get people on board with L. Ron Hubbard in prison. There is and then there is the most successful and affluent one, which is called WISE, the World Institute of Scientology Enterprises, which is business consulting. And they go in and they claim that they can consult with, they mostly consult with doctors and vets and dentists, oddly, but they can do any sort of consulting, any kind of business consulting. And they use Hubbard's administrative methods, because they're so successful running all their churches of Scientology.
Well, they do have a good real estate empire.
Yeah, that if you want to buildings.
It strikes me that the challenging part of this is, if you had a group that did respect individual autonomy and was trying to do charitable things for the purpose of charity, they would target people who were in a bad way, because those are the people who need help. And so trying to figure out, well, wait, is this group just trying to help people who need help, or is it using that model of needing help as a way to get their hooks into people's lives? And that can be a difficult thing to untangle, because the messaging in all of the groups is going to be, no, we're just trying to help them. We're not trying to bring them in. Or if they decide to take our help but don't want anything else, then that's fine. Like, how do you tease that apart in your reflection on how Scientology does it?
Yeah, very easily with Scientology, because Scientology is not a charity and in fact frowns on charity and looks at that as, somewhat askance, right? A little bit, oh, really? Because they're really big on exchange. And Scientology's mantra from L. Ron Hubbard is that Scientology is to help the able become more able. That's the exact phrasing. So, and you could call that ableist. Well, it really is code word for rich people, right? They want money. We haven't said this yet, but to be super super clear, right? Scientology at the end of the day is a money making scam. I mean, none of this mental healing stuff really works. And so they're really all just about the Benjamins at the end of the day. And that's an important thing to remember, because it makes a lot of what they do make a lot more sense. The only time there's any charity in Scientology is when Christmas comes around and they'll collect some cans and take them down to the Salvation Army because it's good PR. They can take some photo ops, right? But otherwise, there is no such thing as charity in Scientology. They don't really do that. And even big Scientology whales or very, very rich Scientologists, often you'll find that like non-Scientologists, they're contributing to charities, quote unquote, that are really just their own trust funds, that are really just kind of come back around to them. There's really not a lot of giving back to the communities, or even we're trying to. There's just photo opportunities and PR opportunities that they'll take advantage of. And then they'll use those photos, to an exaggerated degree to try to prove how charitable and wonderful they are. But when you're in the group, like I was for decades, you know what the cultural attitude within that group is about the homeless, about the unfortunate, about mentally or physically, I'm just going to say, I don't know, disabled or mentally challenged, whatever word you want to use here. Scientologists to a T, every one of them just doesn't care. They don't care about any of that. It's all about me in Scientology. It's about my status and moving myself up the levels of Scientology. It's not about helping other people. So
those images of people wearing yellow vests going out to do the, a hurricane hits, and the Scientologists in the yellow vests descend, and they're there to help.
They're there to help with Scientology.
Oh, So in teasing this apart, I mean, the destabilization, if a group is doing charitable actions, then they're targeting people at difficult points in their lives. If the goal is to get those people to be autonomous, to be whole, but not dependent on the group, that may be one way to distinguish legitimate charity from a form of targeted exploitation of destabilized people for indoctrination.
You got it.
So with that in mind, how are we going to score this?
Oh, I'm going to say intense on this one. This is definitely up there, severe. I'm the biggest one. Scientology is all about leveraging people's weaknesses against them, either to guilt them or to try to goose them into doing Scientology. And that's why I say straight up. It's and with kids, by the way, second gen, which I am, growing up in Scientology, it's ruthless. It's absolutely like you are expected to, pony up right away and be a loyal Scientologist, even as a child.
Okay. All right. So next, belief follows behavior. Action generates the associated beliefs. Groups may encourage members to follow group teachings in order to gain belief. Focus on proselytizing and missionary work is to promote belief in the member as well as to find investigators. What do you think about this? This is kind of where groups try to overcome barriers to belief by saying, even if you don't get it now, just do what we say and you'll get it as you start to do it. So it gets people to participate even before they maybe have come to that point of consent, with the promise that they'll understand it later or they'll get it later. It's a way to allow the indoctrination to take hold, even to work around what you may have as a barrier to belief.
Yes, I will say this is a pretty intense one. I won't say severe, but I will say intense on this one. Reason being that it's a constant refrain. This is not a every now and again. This happens all the time in Scientology. There is a codified exact route or path that you're following when you go into Scientology. It's not a wishy-washy kind of thing. It's a, you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this. Mm-hmm. It's a set of services, classwork and counseling or auditing. I really got to stop using that word counseling. Auditing. And there are levels to this. Okay. It's a series of indoctrination steps. And those steps are not just teaching you things. There's the auditing, right? Which is messing with your head through trance induction and euphoric, clouding. It's hypnotism.
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to that. It's really hypnotism. But bottom line is, if you finish a service and you're like, each service is supposed to have its own end result, and it's supposed to be spectacular and make your life wonderful and all of this. And so if you finish a level or a service and you're feeling like, man, it was all right. Man, I didn't really get that much. I don't know. I didn't really feel like I got my money's worth out of that one. The pat answer every single time is, well, that's resolved by doing your next level.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, you got a problem with that? Yeah. Lots of people do. That's why you got to do your next level. See, because what it does is, what happens is your reactive mind has been opened up now. See, and when you were walking around in the world before you got here, these parts were kind of closed off. But we open up the first box, and then the next box opens up, and you're like, ooh, I don't feel so good. That's why you got to do the next level right away. See, this is how it's explained to you, as though this is a completely rational, reasonable thing. And of course, you need to give us more money, even though you're grossly dissatisfied with your last service. Because of course you are, because here's the explanation. And this,
if you just do the next thing, then it'll all make sense later. Just do it and you'll see.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And this could be all the way up to, the services are basically divided into two phases. You could say the first phase is like the non-confidential levels, and there's a bunch of them, right up until you get to this state of clear, it's called, where your mind is cleared of all your past trauma. That's about halfway along on this bridge. The upper levels are all super hush-hush confidential. Nobody in Scientology knows what's on them until you get there. I was in for 27 years, never learned a damn thing about what was on those levels until I got out and read about it on the internet, right? Those levels, those confidential levels, are the perfect setup. Because if you're having any trouble at the lower levels, the refrain 100% of the time is, oh yeah, that's probably your OT case. Yeah, we got to get you up to those OT levels. That's where you're really going to solve your problems. All this lower level stuff, this stuff is really just Band-Aids compared to what you're, the major surgery you're going to get on those OT levels as a spirit, right? We're going to take you apart. And that's where all the heavy lifting is done. So, and that's where the big bucks are paid. You got to pay thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get up to those OT levels. So this kind of, operation, this kind of line that is given to you over and over again, it's heady stuff, and people fall for it. I wouldn't, you wouldn't think, looking at it from outside, you go, well, that's silly. Anybody could see. Yeah.
No. Well, that's the thing, is that this stuff works. Exactly. So that's such a brilliant example of how this can be actually manifest in a group, and it's unique to Scientology. I think that you may find it if you're a viewer and you're trying to think about your own relationship with a different group, it's going to look a little bit different probably, but this is definitely a unique Scientology manifestation of that. So what do you think, intense or severe?
I'm going to say intense on this one, because I think this is this is used all the time, but it's a subtle thing. It's not in your face. So a lot of Scientologists might look at this and go, "Oh no, this isn't true," but it absolutely, I in my experience, absolutely is.
All right, we'll go with intense. Public commitment. Commitments are expressed aloud. Public statements reinforce belief and dedication to the group. So you may find some groups where there's just a cultural norm where people stand up in a group setting and profess their belief to the group or talk about positive experiences that they had because they followed group instructions, or negative experiences because they broke group instructions. It's a public expression that kind of binds the member to the group and to their past statements.
Yeah. Yeah, this is severe in Scientology, absolutely. And the reason I say that is because, all those services you do as you go up that bridge, this is every Scientologist. This isn't just staff or public. Every single Scientologist, every service you complete, from the beginning service you do, from the very, very first one you do, all the way up to OT8, the top level, you are obligated to write a success story after the completion of a service. And if you don't want to write a success story, that's called a bad indicator. And that's bad, right? And that means that something was wrong. Something needs to be corrected. You did it wrong, see? Because Scientology only results in very good indicators.
Yeah, so you're going to have a success story, or else you did it wrong.
Exactly. You're going to have a success, damn it. And you have to write it. And if you don't, and if you're, and then they put you on that e-meter, and if your needle doesn't do a particular thing called a floating needle, you didn't get it, right? And we're going to go back and we're going to review it, and we're going to drag you back through it, and we're going to figure this out. And by the way, you're going to pay for the privilege of us doing this. It's called a review. It's with a capital R. It's a paid for service. And we're going to get that corrected, see?
Now, who would have access to that once you write it? Who has access to it? Is it a public thing, publicly available?
It can be. You can give permission to have it posted publicly or put it in the, in the church promotional items. They have a success board where they post wins and successes from people. And it can't be, by the way, I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Right? It can't be just trite.
It can't be some knockoff, rushed out, quickie little thing. They want a success. And you better be thanking L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige in your success story, especially if you are giving it publicly or vocally. Like they'll do every week, they have what's called graduation on Friday night. The last half hour of the class period on Friday night is graduation. I used to run the classroom, so this was something we did. And I would have to MC it. And we would have public come up and give public speaking wins and successes from the services they had completed that week. And we would try to get 3 or 4, on a weekly basis to come up and say something. And during those, especially, it was required that you thank L. Ron Hubbard and you thank David Miscavige at the end of it. And if that didn't occur to you to do, the staff were all too happy to remind you that you better say that. So this is a controlled thing, you see, and this is important. This is not just some random, again, organic thing. This is actually part of the cultural control.
It's by design. Yeah. When you reflect on that, how do those public statements or the written statements, how do they affect the way that a person who maybe later has doubts or anything deal with that in their past?
Well, it's pretty clear, because when you've put yourself out there publicly, you've sort of made it known to the world at large that you back up or support or, love this thing. And so when you renege on that, right, especially, by the way, with some of the more choice pieces of indoctrination in Scientology that call for you to never what's the word? How do they say? Withdraw your allegiance, right? There's a code of honor in Scientology that specifically states never withdraw your allegiance to a group once granted. Never? Really? Once a Nazi, always a Nazi? Is that what you're saying, Edward? Right? Like That is exactly what he said. So if you take this code of honor, right, you can never really leave a group because you owe your allegiance to it, right? Well, that means you can't ever change your mind. And
exactly.
I wish I was being a little hyperbolic there, but I'm really not. It really is not ridiculous.
Well, you can see how that serves somebody who's trying to get people to make lifelong, eternity-long commitments, because then you can always hold that over them. We want to have a sense that we've thought things out, and when we make a public expression, you now have to condemn yourself in addition to the group. If you want to break away, you have to say, I was wrong.
That's right.
And that's a hard thing to do, because you're throwing yourself in with the thing that you're trying to detach yourself from. So it's so sophisticated in the way that it gets you in that way. So public commitment, then, how are we going to rate it?
Oh, I'm going to say severe on this one. Also, It occurs to me, by the way, and you might find this of interest, is, that whole suppressive person thing. When they shun you and kick you out, right? The way they explain how you stood up and had all these successes along the way is you're a liar. You never really had any of those successes. You were just lying the whole time.
So they flip the switch on you and you're all bad after that.
Exactly, because you have to now be, if you leave Scientology or speak out against it, then you really never could have been a real Scientologist, see, because real Scientology always works. So it can't be that it didn't work on you, see. It had to be that you lied about it.
Oh, there's so much in that, but we're going to get to some of those. Okay, so we're going to rank this one as severe then, based on your recommendation there. And next we'll get to proselytizing. Members are encouraged to propagate teachings to outsiders. This not only maintains or increases the size of the group, but also soothes cognitive dissonance, consumes time, and provides opportunities for public commitment. So we can see how some of these other things we've talked about all come together with the act of proselytizing. I know some religions, like the Jewish religion, for example, does not really have a proselytizing component. So you'll see some variety there. How did this manifest in Scientology?
Okay, so this is a real interesting one, because this is one of the ones where they talk the talk, but they don't really walk the walk. And I think people are going to find this a little interesting, because it's changed over time. When I first got into Scientology in the 1980s, when I actually started doing classwork and stuff, I was raised with it in the 70s, but I actually really got in the 80s. And they were intensely interested in proselytizing. And there were a lot of programs and seminars and workshops held for Scientologists on how to do it. And Hubbard has exact methodologies worked out as to how you talk to other people about Scientology. It's not random. He actually gives you steps to follow and stuff like that, so that you're dealing with the person's, disbelief and criticisms and stuff like that before you try to get them in. And this sequence is called the dissemination drill. Dissemination meaning spreading seeds, right? It's planting it, right? So you're disseminating Scientology. This is how it's talked about. They don't use the word proselytize. Nobody ever uses that word in Scientology. They use the word disseminate or dissemination. So dissemination's a big thing in Scientology. There's a lot of literature on it. Hubbard was very keen on it. There's a whole body routing thing they do. That's what they call it, routing bodies. They go out on the outside the church and try to pass out flyers or sell books and bring people in. So there's a whole methodology to this that's rather famous in Scientology. And in the 1970s, especially when Scientology was having its heyday, they were all about this. So, and they would get public volunteers, not just staff or Sea Org, but public would come and help bring people in, stuff like that. And again, these seminars and workshops were being held all the time. I used to hold them. I was as a staff member and Sea Org member, I was very interested in getting public Scientologists to bring in their friends and family. And
this would have been the time where I was encountering Dianetics television commercials in my Saturday morning cartoons or whatever.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So, so in the 1980s, there were big Dianetics ad campaigns, and they were interested in getting in new members. But here's the weird thing, okay? This is actually weird because it's totally opposite world. You wouldn't think that this would, it doesn't really make any sense. But David Miscavige is either so incompetent, he's the current leader of Scientology, he took over after Hubbard. He's either so incompetent or just plain stupid or hates people so much, and I think it's actually that one, that he's not really pushing the organization in any way now to proselytize or bring new people in. Everything is about fundraising now, either fundraising for new buildings or fundraising for church money, for membership in the church, which is not the same thing as bringing new people in. There are paid membership levels in Scientology, and you just give money to the church and you get a title. I am a patron of Scientology. If you give them $5,000, you're a patron. If you give them $10,000, and I don't know if these figures are still correct, but it's around this, you give them $10,000, you're a silver patron. You give them $25,000, you're a gold patron. You give them $50,000, you're a platinum patron. You see, and it goes up from there up to, you know, patron gloritorious if you give them like $5 million, right? So you have all these levels, and Scientologists, you know, really work to climb these levels because it's all about status. That's not new membership. But that's where all of the fundraising and workshops and work that's done in Scientology now is directed, is at money for this stuff. And Miscavige is kind of eschewed or given up on getting new people in. It just doesn't really happen.
You know, that really reminds me of, there's the recent documentaries about the Heaven's Gate group. They reflect a similar transition where early in the group's existence, there were a lot of meetings, a lot of calls to get new people in.
Yep.
And then there was a period of time where they tried to do that, but the public had become a little bit more sophisticated. We were no longer in the 60s where people were trying to find new age spiritualism, and people were not as open to something that could be seen as a science fiction UFO cult. And so they did a series of trying to recruit people, but then they kind of got laughed at, or people saw the beliefs as so detached from reality that they were a source of ridicule rather than people actually believing. And they shifted at that point. They said, you know what, we're closing our classroom, is the paradigm they used. We're no longer looking to gain new people. And so then they turned inward, and that's where things got even more radical. And I wonder if the public's awareness of some of the more extreme fringe aspects of Scientology has made the public less open to proselytizing efforts that has kind of caused that same sort of reaction.
I would say absolutely. Everything I was just describing was sort of internally created by Miscavige. At the same time, you're nailing it, because as of about mid-2000s, when anonymous protests started occurring, and this was around the time of Tom Cruise jumping around on Oprah's couch and bad-mouthing Brooke Shields and psychiatric drugs and stuff like that with Matt Lauer, and basically making an ass out of himself.
And South Park, I think, was around there too.
South Park came out, that's right. The whole Trapped in the Closet episode, where they revealed the upper level, you know, some of the upper level scriptures of Scientology. All of that was a kind of perfect storm to really destroy any credibility that Scientology was already on very shaky ground when it came to credibility. But it was mostly a kind of unknown, mysterious UFO alien kind of sci-fi cult. People didn't really get it, but they knew Tom Cruise was part of it, so it was probably cool. And John Travolta and, you know, some of these other celebrities were Scientologists, and so there's probably something to it. But, you know, maybe it's for me, maybe it's for not, whatever. But they didn't really get it. And after all of that happened, and the exposure started happening at a whole different level, and the media realized that Scientology could be exposed and they wouldn't necessarily lose their shirt over it because they were so litigious. Once all that changed in the mid-2000s, Scientology's efforts at proselytizing became a joke, right? And the Super Bowl ad that they do every year, people just laugh and ridicule it now, right? And they know that there's actually something dangerous about Scientology, that it's destructive to people, that they've covered up, child sexual abuse, and child labor trafficking and all kinds of nonsense that's gone on over the decades, both under Hubbard and under Miscavige. This is now more generally known about, and that has absolutely been a spike in the heart of Scientology's efforts to proselytize.
So what do you think? Proselytizing, how would you rate it? We have none, mild, moderate, intense, or severe.
Yeah, I would say at this point, oddly, I'm going to say moderate, because they're really not making very intense efforts at all at proselytizing anymore. And so I'll answer in the present and say they've pulled their flippers in. They are very internally facing now. And they're really not getting new members.
It's funny, we saw it even in that page about is Scientology a cult, where they kind of did some hand waving and said, well, the reason that people are skeptical of Scientology is just because people are skeptical of religion in general. And so it kind of shields them from having to address the very specific criticisms that people may have that you addressed in terms of child sexual abuse and the destructive and harmful practices of it. But that's, all part of the story of how they, as you say, now have to turn internally rather than through proselytizing. So we will mark that as moderate and go on to the next one. Financial pressure. Requirement of excessive financial contributions, and this is tied to significant punishment for not contributing.
This is absolutely at the severe level with Scientology. Like I said before, Scientology is a money-making scam, period, end of story. That is actually what it is. Everything, all the beliefs, everything else is really just window dressing. It's shocking to say something so reductionist and so simple about a group that is an international, 70-year-long existence group, but it's true. That is really what it is. And so they are all about money, and they are high pressure. Really high pressure. They'll come knocking at your door at 2 a.m. I've done it. I have done that. Hi, got to talk to you, dude. It's 2 a.m. I know, but this is important, man. Future of the planet, dude. Come on. I have done that. Okay, and not just. I have had that done to me also back when I was. Okay, it's the culture. It's the world of Scientology. You can expect that, and nobody in Scientology is particularly immune to it either. By the way, I saw very, very materially wealthy people who, 2 a.m, gotta talk. It's
funny. Even before Xenu, before Tom Cruise, before any of what I now understand is the dark landscape of Scientology, the very first thing I ever heard about this religion was that you had to take these mandatory courses, and there were people who had spent $100,000 on just these courses. And of course, in my religious background in Mormonism, there's a very strong negative idea that religions would charge money for the things that they do in that way. And so it was like, oh yeah, that's clearly a cult because it's just, they're charging $100,000. That's ridiculous.
Yep.
And so I believe you when you say that it's a big part of it. That was the leading tip of the spear in my introduction to Scientology.
Absolutely. And let me further clarify to make it crystal clear for everybody. These are not voluntary donations these are not optional donations, right? They call them, it's really kind of sick to even call them donations because that's not really how it's structured. This is really much more of a business model. You have to pay to play in Scientology. They don't just give you these confidential levels. You have to pay for them, and you pay for them not only with money, but also with time commitments and, working for the church, doing projects for the church, buying things in excess. Like, for example, if you're making up for some moral transgressions that they're, holding over your head, you might have to go about doing the makeup, the damage for that, by buying 5 packages of Scientology books, which cost like, $1,200 per package, and donating them to libraries.
Wow.
That kind of thing, right? And by the way, the libraries might just as well throw those books out as keep them, right? More often than not, they throw them away. So you're literally just throwing money down the toilet, but that money goes to Scientology. See, right. So it's not throwing the money down the toilet.
No, and the cost of publishing those books was pennies on the dollar for that.
Yeah, the penny.
All right, well, let's take a look at that then, and we will rate it at, what do you think? Severe?
Severe, yeah, absolutely. It's all about the money. If there were on this particular one, if there was a higher than severe, I'd hit it.
I'll have to put a dial that goes to 11 on some of these. All right, so, okay, the next one. Indirect directives. Certain restrictions or demands on behavior are implied rather than expressed. The logical elements for a given conclusion are supplied, leaving the member to draw the conclusion themselves. Leadership remains innocent of issuing any unseemly demands. Now, I'm probably going to reword this one a little bit because people are a little bit confused by it, but the way I try to frame it or describe it is it's a subversion of free will and free agency. They tell you the things that good people do or that the right thing to do is, but then they say, but we're not going to tell you to do it. It's up to you. You have the freedom to choose. Now, there's also unspoken messages about, well, the only people that wouldn't choose this are bad people or people who are plagued by sin or doubt or suppressive. And so it's up to you. Yep. And so then if there's any destructive or harmful or bad aspects of the things that they've told you you're supposed to do, you can't blame them because it was your choice to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And the way that this makes sense in Scientology, a couple different ways, one of them being that code of honor I talked about earlier. Excuse me. But before I get into that, much, much, much more broadly applied in terms of this point in Scientology is, did we lose Jonathan? Well, I hope he comes back. I'll just finish talking about this and maybe he'll come back. What you have in Scientology is thought policing, and you self-thought police in Scientology, and that's how this manifests, right? Is you are told, you're never told, don't look up bad information or negative or critical information about Scientology on the internet. You're just asked questions like, well, who would do that? Why would you do that? Why would you go to some other source than L. Ron Hubbard for information about Scientology? That doesn't make any sense. That's weird, right? And you're having this conversation with an ethics officer who is like a police officer in Scientology. So it's not just an innocent conversation between Scientologists. It's a pressure conversation about, hey man, what are you doing? What's up with that? Why are you looking at that stuff? Why would you do that? And once you have that conversation, of course, the end result of that is, oh, I really shouldn't be looking at any of this ever under any circumstances, especially when you're told, the fact that you're doing that threatens your ability to walk up the bridge and do the rest of these services. I mean, you keep doing that and there could be consequences, but they're sort of ... They're not spelled out because when they ... you, your imagination fills in all those blanks, right? You can make it significantly worse. So,
and it allows them later to honestly say, we never told them that. We don't teach that. We don't, because it's an indirect way of getting people to comply and to understand consequences. And so it's kind of I describe it as the illusion of free will, where they don't want you to be able to even say that you've been manipulated because they get you to think that it's all your own free choice. And so anytime they denigrate what other people would understand as informed consent, where you do need to know everything before you consent to participating in these things. And, that's kind of how all of this is woven together into that theme of indirect directives. So what do you think?
Oh, no, this is severe in Scientology. Absolutely. This is also how they get people to disconnect, by the way.
What do you mean?
The whole shunning suppressive person thing. They'll say, look, we're not telling you they might not even say this out loud, but if it comes down to it, they will say, look, we're not saying you have to disconnect from this person. You have to kick this person out of your life. What we are saying is, here's what L. Ron Hubbard has to say about this person. And we have to wonder why it is you'd want to voluntarily remain connected to this person when they're psychotic, according to L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant example of that.
Right. And of course, you're sitting there going, and of course, if you are to remain connected with this person, we wouldn't be able to continue to service you in our church. I mean, you know that, right? Because of what L. Ron Hubbard says here in this bulletin, right? I mean, you understand the position we're in, right? that you're putting us in, right? You know, so it's all reframed to, you know, you're doing this, not us.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think those are some great examples, and we'll go ahead and mark that severe and go on to our next one. Oh, this one's fun. So, elitism. The members of the group are the chosen people, exalted, righteous. Members are made to feel special when compared to outsiders.
Oh my God, dude. Oh my God. Okay, let me see if I can drag this one out of this. I don't think I'll have the direct quote, but it was Scientology auditors are in the upper 10th of the upper 20th of intelligent human beings on the planet. I think that's the direct quote from L. Ron Hubbard, right? Upper 10th of the upper 20th, right? Of intelligent human beings on the planet. L. Ron Hubbard goes out of his way over and over and over again to goose up, you know, the ego of Scientologists. And of course, L. Ron Hubbard's ego was monstrous. It was, you know, it'd fill every room he ever walked into. And that trait passes on to Scientologists who are exalted constantly, you know, on the positive reinforcement side. Scientology is not all negative. There's also this positive reinforcement going on where, and I don't mean negative in that, I mean, it's all harmful, but the positive reinforcement over here is love bombing, is how great you are, how amazing you are, how incredibly fortunate you are to have walked in the door, how able of you, how amazing of you, how OT of you is the Scientology phrasing, right? Is how is you know, how fortuitous, but not just in a karmic fate kind of way, but you are so able, you are so OT, you were able to recognize, you know, that this was the group that, you know, you gravitated toward because you saw, you were aware of how special we are, and that makes you a more special human being, see, than the rest of humanity who doesn't even get it yet. Right.
Yeah. And you can imagine how when you combine them targeting people who are at difficult points in their lives or insecure or vulnerable points in their lives, think about teenagers or young adults where they're developing their sense of identity. They don't yet have any firm footing. There's a lot of self-doubt. And suddenly they're presented with this where just the fact that I was interested in it, that I came to the first session, they're already telling me, well, there's something unique and special about me. I have this amazing insight. Maybe I do. And then that just feeds on itself. And you start to develop your sense of specialness that is so closely bound with the group that eventually, if you consider leaving the group, well, then you're going to let go of that elite status. And you can't do that. And it's just it's so effective and insidious, but it can feel just completely illuminating at the time, you know, if you're subject to it.
That's right. That's right. It's very, you know, what people kind of don't quite click on when we talk about this, I think, is they don't quite remember what it feels like when they're at the receiving end of this kind of admiration or this kind of love bombing, right? It feels so empowering. When it's done right, it's invisible. Like you don't, you know, there's flattery. There's the, you know, the obsequious, like, oh, you're so wonderful. And you know, you see that, right? When love bombing is done right, you feel more supercharged as a person and more, you know, it's awe-inspiring. You feel amazing about yourself. And you're supposed to, right? Because you're being so heavily validated for the choices you're making in being part of this group. And
And we're going to get to love bombing and how it's a little bit different from this sense of elitism, but there is an absolute connection between the two.
yeah.
You've mentioned several times in the lead up to this particular question, this idea that you're going to save the universe. And like this, the idea that you and what you do is somehow going to save the galaxy. You could imagine that does give you an inflated sense, not only of your importance, but the importance of your compliance with the group in order to achieve that noble goal. And it's just woven throughout it as I hear you, describing even some of this other stuff.
That's right. And I haven't even talked about, I mean, hell, in the Sea Org, the dial goes to 20. I mean, it's ridiculous how ego pumped we would be in the Sea Org all the time. And the juxtaposition of that with all the physical and mental abuse made for a very crazy making environment.
It's a great term for it, crazy making. All right, so elitism, what are we going to call it? What are we going to rate it as?
Absolutely. Scientology is all about that.
Severe, then?
Yeah.
All right. Dissociative states. Transinduction and dissociative states. Critical thinking skills are reduced through regular encouragement of receptive mental states. Altered states can be mild and seem normal and include concentration, fatigue, boredom, and hunger.
Yeah, this is also severe in Scientology. This is literally the linchpin on which Scientology auditing rests. This is the thing that makes Scientology work. Is dissociative states. This is what it is doing to people, and the non-obvious part of this is all the indoctrination that occurs before the transinduction. So it's interpreted as something else, and I kind of explained a little bit earlier when I said they indoctrinate you that you have this evil part of yourself that we're going to go in and exorcise or remove. Right? First, it's the reactive mind. Once that's done and you reach the level of clear, then it becomes body thetans or invisible entities that are glommed onto you, and we're going to exorcise them, right? Through the Scientology processes of, again, putting you into a very dissociative state. Psychologically, it is disassociation. You even get to the point where you feel like you can be outside of your body, have an out-of-body experience as a spiritual entity. You're told that you're not even your body. You are something separate from your body. You are this invisible, massless, energyless, nothing called a thetan. And that's what you are in Scientology. And your body is just something you carry around with you like a car or a set of clothes. And this leads to all kinds of other issues. But when it comes to this point of disassociation, that's this duality that's presented that is completely illusory. And that is what opens the door to the transinduction and the euphoria, and then interpreting all of that through this lens of spirituality and reactive minds and all of that. And so a destructive process is reframed in your mind as a constructive, positive experience. And then you get addicted to it, because the euphoria that comes with those Scientology auditing is not chemically dissimilar to drug tripping, getting drunk, and or falling in love. Same chemicals are flying around in your head, and you're interpreting it. It's all about interpreting the experience, right? There's nothing wrong with having a euphoric experience if you understand that it's just a euphoric experience. It's not you're erasing all the trauma from from a million years ago in some incident where you blew up a planet, right? That's not reality. But you know reality for yourself because it explains this euphoric experience you're having.
You're alluding to kind of a pattern that you see happen in a bunch of different groups. In the military, they call it like, you come into the military, they break you down till you're nothing, and then they build you up like the man they want you to be. Well, in these groups, what will happen is they'll go through that destabilization process through the indoctrination, trying to show you and convince you that you're broken. And you may resist that a little bit. And in that struggle to resist it, that's where that destabilization is happening until you finally realize that you're nothing, that you're broken, that you can't trust anything about yourself, and you let go of even the desire or need to try to resist any of the indoctrination, and you've dissociated from your sense of integrity, and that leaves you wide open, so that now that they have shown you that you are nothing, now they can come in and save you. And it's in that saving of showing you what you can be if you adopt the ideology, and showing you a little bit of how great it will be and how great you will be and what you can do to save the universe. In the case that euphoria then binds you so closely to the group, and that pattern is just seen again and again and again in all of these destructive organizations, because it's how they insert themselves in between you and yourself so that you become part of them. Does that make sense?
That is a beautiful summary of what we call brainwashing.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see, because we've already hit the destabilization, we've got the dissociative, and we'll get to the euphoria induction later. But just for the viewers, make sure you see that this is a pattern that is it's established, and you can see it express itself in different ways in different groups. Yep. All right. So for this dissociative state, how are we going to rate it?
Yeah, this is severe. Absolutely. This is, again, this is the linchpin on which Scientology rests.
All right. Yeah. Oh, this is a big one. Okay, guilt and shame. A cycle of guilt and shame comes from repressed doubts, social pressure, and failure to meet impossible standards.
Yeah, all the above. Scientology is absolutely severe on this one. This is how the control operates after the euphoria, right? Is all the guilt and shame. This is one of the negative reinforcements in Scientology is you've committed moral transgressions, you have moral sins. If your behavior is in any way anti-Scientology, that's indicative of the fact that you have moral transgressions, because only a criminal would resist Scientology, see? Or a psychotic, crazy person, or an antisocial. Everybody else is fully on board with Scientology. So if you are not, clearly you got to screw loose, right? And so the guilt, the shame, all the rest, and that's the lightest level of it. I mean, they'll stick you in a room with a ream of paper and not let you leave until you've written down all your sins, all your moral transgressions, right? Time, place, form, and event. They want all the deets, all the details, right? And you're not done until they say you're done. So, that kind of thing is commonplace in Scientology. I'm not talking about something that happens every now and again. It happens on a daily basis in that outfit.
And when people describe guilt and shame, why are these, it's just like the same thing, isn't it? Well, there's a subtle difference between them, in that guilt talks about you being deficient in some particular act. Either you've done something wrong or you haven't done the right thing, and you could confine it just to your, complicity in that act itself. And then shame is something a little bit different, where whether or not you've been guilty of certain acts is an index of your worth as a person and your standing as a person. Are you a good person? Are you a worthy person? And it's something that can be ephemeral and part of the culture, where you'll feel the judgment of the people around you who know that you're guilty of certain acts and that it has a reflection on you as an individual, or it can be something that's part of your own internal dialogue and your own internal assessment of your place in the universe and your worthiness to exist with your peers. And what I hear you saying is that there's some of that kind of both external and internal to how your existence is in Scientology.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, guilt is something you experience in your head. Shame is something you demonstrate to demonstrate that guilt or show that you feel bad about it, because you can be guilty and not feel bad. Right? So shame comes when it's, oh no, I feel so bad about this. And that's what's leveraged against you to get you to give more money, work for the church, do all the things they want you to do, because they're offering you a path to redemption.
That's a good point.
Right? So you don't have to feel that shame anymore. We can relieve you of that guilt and shame if you do exactly what we tell you. And that's the trap. That's where they trap you.
Yeah, that's the disease they've inflicted upon you, for which they provide the only cure, and it keeps you coming back again and again. Right. All right, so what do you give it?
Absolutely. Like, again, this is foundational to Scientology's control model. Is the guilt and shame. Absolutely.
All right, love bombing. We've talked about this a few times. Friendliness, flattery, praise, and affection are used to entice participation and attendance for potential recruits and to retain members who may be showing less enthusiasm or are thinking of leaving. Members must project an image of happiness for the sake of the group. And when I describe this, I try to say, this is stuff that is inauthentic. Like, you can have any group that's trying to put its best foot forward is going to be welcoming and inviting to new members. But this is where it goes kind of above and beyond that. And not only that, you're kind of told like you need to fake it. If you're not feeling it, you got to put the front, because if you're not overwhelming new people with this goodness that we have, then it's going to reflect poorly on the group. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. The awful part about this, and the thing I want to comment on about this, is that it can also, because people are either recruited in a vulnerable state or are kept in a vulnerable state while they're in the group. This is how the love bombing is actually perceived by the individuals as sincere and real. And let me give you an example of this. Probably the most powerful one I can think of is not an instance where I was love bombed, but it was an instance where I wasn't, because I wanted to leave. I'd been involved for 27 years, whatever. I was ready to go, and I hadn't yet gone down the internet rabbit hole of knowing all the lies that L. Ron Hubbard had told in his life. I didn't yet know that. But I did know at this point that the organization was pretty screwed. David Miscavige was clearly not on top of things. There was way too much concentration on money. I wasn't happy with the lifestyle of a Sea Org member anymore after 17 years of that, where it's 24/7 just working for the church. And I wanted out of that situation, but I didn't want out of Scientology. I wanted to still do Scientology. So I played along, and I jumped through all the hoops they wanted me to, so that I could no longer be a Sea Org member, but I could still be a Scientologist in good standing. That's why I didn't just get up and go one day. So, you know what I was deathly afraid of during that interim period where I was wanting to leave, but they hadn't let me go yet, was getting love bombed. Because I knew, and I didn't think about it in those terms. I didn't know that that was a word to describe this. I just knew that if they chose to treat me kindly rather than cruelly, there's a very good chance I would end up changing my mind. And I was afraid of that because I knew how susceptible I was to it. In other words, I worked with a group of people very intensely. There was a small number of people, about 10 or 15 of them, who I worked with for years as a Sea Org, in the Sea Org, who I considered my friends, who were my closest relations, including my wife. I was married in the Sea Org. And that group of people were the people that I was closest to. I loved them. I really did. To this day, I still like some of those people, even though I haven't talked to them in 10 years. I hope they get out, and I would love to reconnect with some of them. And I told them, when I gave them my resignation letter, I put it in writing. I said, yeah, I'm leaving. I don't want to be handled, I said. Don't try to handle me. Right. And what I meant by that was, I knew my biggest vulnerability was if they called me up to a room and all of them were in the room and they sat me down and were like, Chris, don't go. What are you doing, man? And they exuded care and love and admiration for me and my work and what I had been doing all those years. Because, after 17 years of this bullshit, I was pretty fed up. Right? Because there was an extreme lack of acknowledgement in this group. So if they sat me down and over acknowledged and really went for it and really went for the love bombing, I knew I was vulnerable to that. Right. And I was actually a little thankful that they didn't take that tack, because when I said I wanted to leave, everybody got so pissed at me that they didn't want to talk to me. Right. And so it ended up going that direction. And I'm sitting here today thankful that happened the way it happened, because it's that powerful. You even know it's coming, and yet you can't resist it when it's happening, right? And anybody who thinks they're immune to this or is looking at me like, yeah, that sounds stupid. okay, I guess, but for me, it was very powerful.
No, especially when that's your entire social world, and we as social creatures thrive on the recognition, admiration, and positive connections we have the people around us. And if that is the thing that you're vulnerable to, then it's remarkable that you had the insight to know that you could even change your perspective if subjected to that. But that just is a testament to how effective love bombing can be. Whether your first interaction with the group, or as you're bringing up, people don't think about it that much, is when people doubt, and love bombing can be used to bring people back in.
That's
so
right.
what is your take on this then? You mentioned before, you gave a brilliant description of just how uplifting and invigorating that feeling is when you get all of those, dopamine or whatever drugs are, bathing your brain in that good sense of euphoria when people around you are giving you this praise. So that binds you to this group, especially when it's found at a moment of difficulty in your life.
That's right.
How strong was this in Scientology?
Severe, absolutely. Again, foundational to its control pattern.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, social pressure. Social acceptance and rejection are used to reward and punish. A member becomes driven with a desire to conform.
Yeah, absolutely severe for all the reasons we've already laid out. I mean, the ultimate expression of this is getting declared a suppressive person and getting kicked out. But that's the ultimate expression. There are lots of levels between, being a regular, dyed-in-the-wool, everyday member of Scientology and getting declared. There's all kinds of steps. It's not 0 to 100. They'll do all kinds of things to get you to conform. And social ostracization and the leveraging of that is very, very much a part of that. When you're not in good standing, or you are in, you're in ethics, you're in the, you're considered an ethics particle is what you're called. You're an ethics particle.
That's a little dehumanizing,
right?
Yeah.
There's so many of these little dehumanizing phrases, and that's one of them. Or you're a degraded being, a DB. That's a label in Scientology they can strap you with, right, for a while. This kind of stuff, right? There's all kinds of levels to that, I guess I want to say. And this is even, the funny thing is that this is even documented. It's in the church policy. I could pull out the policy letter and show you. It's called the levels of ethics gradients, right? And getting kicked out of the church is the last one. But there's about 40 or 50 levels that have been codified. It's
funny because when you have a group like this where you are isolated socially, the social world of these closed groups becomes your entire world. And so the consequences of being out of step with your social peers weigh so heavily on your life, because it's not like you might find in people who aren't bound up by a closed social group, where you may have a group of friends in one social milieu, another group of friends at work, another group, and in each different thing only affects your life to a certain extent. And so, if the guys that you meet up with at the pub aren't part of your particular group, and they're like, hey, what's up with you? And it's like, I did such and such, that was a violation, then they're not going to immediately shun you or something. They may actually be a source of support. And that's where the isolation totally amps up the impact that social pressure has in conformity. Yep. And you've described it, the way that it totally affected you.
Exactly. Yeah, no, this is another severe one for Scientology, no question about it. This leveraging of your social standing, right? Yeah. And as I went over with the membership levels earlier, right? Social standing is everything in Scientology.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, we are social creatures, and it's wired into our mind to be responsive to these things. And these groups just kind of take those wires and use them like puppet strings in order to get people to conform, under the heading of the religious ideology and the control. Yep. So we will rate that then for you a severe.
Yep. Big time.
Okay. You've alluded to this in the past, but maybe we can get you to talk more specifically about it. Induced phobias. Fears are instilled, which are either imaginary, based on real or exaggerated consequences, or on artificial effects created from group pressures.
Yeah. This is, again, foundational to their system. The fears that are installed in Scientology are a few, but mainly fall under the umbrella of we will deny you further access to this path of salvation if you do not comply. And this path to salvation is the only path to salvation that exists on this entire planet, and in fact, in this entire universe. There is no Scientology anywhere else. You have found the one place at the one time when you can actually kind of break out of this prison that you have been trapped in for quite literally trillions of years. So you want out? You got to comply. You got to follow the rules. You got to do what we're telling you to do. And that if you buy into, the second you buy into the idea that this group has that only path to salvation, they own you. Right? Because they're
that salvation is kind of like the carrot. What is the stick? Like, what is damnation or hell or demons or whatever the fear is? What does that look like for Scientology?
This.
Okay, the world we live in.
Yeah, for Scientologists, their vision of the future is that they are in the driver's seat, that they are God, that they have a supernatural, spiritual ability and awareness that puts them on par with a creator figure, that they have ultimate power and ability in this or any other universe. And so if that's the goal, and it's this amazing carrot that Hubbard offers, and that is, and I'm not even exaggerating, in the ultimate sense, that is what Scientology is offering. You'll pay anything. You'll jump through any hoops. You would do anything to have ultimate power, right? It would be like being a genie, only you're not trapped in the lamp, right? You got everything.
That's interesting because it's different from the usual paradigm where usually there's this future denigrated state that you will be sent to, and that is the thing that creates the fear. And what you're describing is not that, but rather there's this future glorious, all-powerful state that if you don't comply, you'll be deprived of. That's right. So it's almost like they could say, hey, we don't have any damnation, we don't have any stick, all we have is a carrot. But if you want the carrot, you have to jump through the hoops.
Exactly. See, the damnation is, but we won't give it to you unless you follow our rules. See, and when it's draconian authoritarian rules, and money and money and money and money and money, right? Then you are quickly, not only are you running out of money, but you're getting credit cards and loans and mortgages and cashing out your kid's trust fund and anything and everything you can do to, no, let me walk this path. I must walk this path. I have to do it. And Scientologists will go through all kinds of extreme activities, right, in order to do that. And that's just at the public level. Once you start, if they recruit you to save the world by being a Scientology staff member, then the levels of abuse, are amped up. Because then what's happening is the alternative of you not succeeding as a staff member or Sea Org member is you are personally dooming the entire world to this infinite prison existence where they're trapped, in these bodies and they can't ever get out because you didn't work hard enough. So now they're leveraging your goodwill and care about your fellow man, not about yourself, but about other people. Yeah. And they're leveraging that guilt and that you're not working hard enough. You're not getting enough done. The stats aren't high enough. The money's not high enough. We're not having a big enough effect on this planet. And it's because you guys aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing. See? And that becomes the hell on earth for your existence, which is most of my Scientology experience was on that end of it.
Okay. Now, there was another facet to this where the fears that they may instill in you could also be in the form of what will happen to you if you leave, like how your life will fall apart. And this is tied to what they say that they are giving you as part of your membership. But we've heard people say that, you could take the paradigm of like the abusive spousal relationship where they'd say, well, you're nothing without me. If you left, you'd be, a drug addict on the gutter of the street or something, just using the fear of what you might become. Is that play a role in the messaging?
Big time, especially when you're trying to leave. When I was trying to leave the Sea Org, when I was, again, working for the church, and this was coming straight from, you would hear stories. This would come straight from Miscavige's mouth. These kind of lines of, oh yeah, you're going to leave the Sea Org, you'll be flipping burgers at McDonald's, right? You'll be sweeping the streets. You're going to be nothing. You're going to be no one. You're going to be a big zilch zero failure, right? That's the statement that's being made there. Because believe me, in Scientology, flipping burgers for a living is a meaningless, nothing existence, right? Compared to
they're raising the hourly wage on that.
Yeah, Scientologists have a whole different view on that, right? So, point is, absolutely. I was told numerous times when I was trying to leave what a failure I was going to be, and how I wouldn't amount to anything without Scientology in my life. And in fact, I both heard, and I have to say, I got to fess up, I used this line myself when I was doing recruitment. We would go out and we would talk to Scientologists. I was a Sea Org member, and we wanted them to sign that billion-year contract and come be part of the Sea Org. So we would give them this briefing where we would basically guilt the fuck out of them, right? We would talk to them about how bad everything is in the world and how it's going to hell in a handbasket, and how we need, more Sea Org members because we're the only ones who are doing anything about it. And that was basically the central message of the recruitment. But what we would tell people is, we would stick them with this, is we would say, look, now that you know all this information we've given you, all this behind the door, closed door briefing, secret, super secret stuff, now you're responsible for that knowledge. And if you don't act in a responsible way, in other words, join the Sea Org, which is the most responsible thing you can do. And the awful thing is, when I was a Sea Org member, I really believed this to be true. So I said this with all sincerity. I would say, if you don't take that knowledge and take that responsibility on your shoulders and go with it, you're denying your responsibility in this picture. And you're going to do yourself in, just like criminals do, because they don't acknowledge their responsibility for the bad things they're doing. And look at their lives. Their lives suck, right? Criminals' lives are awful. They have to hide all the time. They're constantly in fear and paranoid. So yeah, they got all this money, but so what? Well, that's going to be you, because you're not joining the Sea Org, see? Because that's the responsible thing to do, see? Yeah. And you're going to end up, I know a guy, and I can't believe I said this. I knew a guy who knew a guy, right? Who actually ended up dead 3 days after a Sea Org recruitment briefing, right? Because he didn't take responsibility, and he got into a car accident and he died. What am I going to say? I'm just telling you the truth, man. This is powerful stuff. You better act.
There's such a heady mix of like the indirect directives, the phobia induction. It's all there in the soup. There.
And I actually said those words to somebody. I am so horribly ashamed of myself for having done that. To this day, I still feel like, oh my God, what an asshole. I was such an asshole. But I felt I wasn't lying. I didn't think I was lying. I didn't think I was doing some awful control thing. I thought I was being as real as I could be.
Well, just like anybody that finds themselves in these groups, their identity and their agency has been subverted by the groups. And so, you have to be kind to yourself once you grow out of that paradigm and look back on what you did. You were under the influence of people who deceived and manipulated you. Exactly. And in some cases, they got you to be part of that process. And, I think you're doing a great job of untangling that and trying to undo any damage that you did. Okay, so let's take a look at induced phobias. How are you gonna rate it here?
Yeah. Again, foundational. Right. Yeah, severe.
Okay, blame reversal. The leadership, the group, and doctrines are above reproach. So any failed promises, bad situations, etc., are always the fault of the member.
Oh yeah, this is absolutely severe in Scientology, and here's why. I'll be very simple about this. Scientology, the Church of Scientology, has never once, in my experience or knowledge, not once has it ever publicly acknowledged anything bad or wrong in its operation or activities. It is always the fault of the ex-members or critics who are lying or deceiving or hyperbolically claiming things. None of it's ever true. They've never done anything wrong and are incapable of error. That's the attitude of the official attitude of the Church of Scientology in its public statements. And of course, that is the attitude of the church internally as well. It is never the fault of the church. It is always either a bad apple or it's you. And that is about as absolute a statement about Scientology as I could make. I never once saw an exception to what I just said.
Well, so I imagine then that we're at the severe rating on that one.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll do it. Okay, we got to Euphoria induction. The euphoria of group participation and fulfilling the members' ideals motivates good behavior and reduces doubts while proving the validity of the group.
Yep.
We touched on this earlier. Anything else to say about it?
It's not only does this happen, I will say, the most powerful expression of this in Scientology is in the auditing. Okay, you're hypnotized, you're trance-induced, and you're led down this path of fantasy with a lot of false memory syndrome, by the way, because of all the past life crap. And this lifetime crap, too, by the way. There are people who have recalled stress and trauma they experienced, which were complete fantasies, never happened, didn't happen the way they remembered it, right? Our memories are horribly bad already. We already know this as a mechanism through neuroscience, but Scientology amps that false memory syndrome up enormously. That's bad enough, but you also have the group euphoria, where you have these events or you have these group collective activities occur where they're all amped up at once, and there is a tremendous, I will absolutely compare it tit for tat with Nuremberg rallies, right? As held in Nazi Germany. It's the same kind of emotion-based, let's get everybody on the same page and really going and rah, rah, off with the motherland, right? In Scientology, it's look at those statistics, look at all the acceptance we're getting, look at all the numbers of people flooding into the churches, right? And it's so bad. Let me give you this as an example to demonstrate. This is the last briefing David Miscavige did, just I think it was 2 or 3 months ago. He finally comes out after Scientology churches around the world had been basically closed, doors locked for the last 2 years because of COVID. They shut down. And he comes out, and all the Scientologists know this. They hate the COVID protocols. They had to wear masks and gloves and use all this cleaner and do all this crap. And the church was very demanding about the COVID protocols. So much so that Scientologists actually got visibly upset and angry, and even some mutinous, to the degree that they were like, no, we're not doing this. This is fucked. It was that bad. So that's the reality of the situation in the last 2 years in Scientology. And then David Miscavige comes out on stage at the first briefing after all of this and says Scientology has expanded by a factor of 36 expansion in the last 2 years. And people are like, are you out of your... I mean, it was just a whopper so big, even Scientologists couldn't believe it. And normally...
Wait, is he saying the church grew 36 times its size before that?
Yes. That was the claim he made. I don't even know what he was thinking coming out saying that. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking with a lot of things these days. Scientology is seriously imploding right now. Miscavige is leading this thing right over a cliff. But that's a whole different talk. Did
they have investments in the mask companies or the vaccine companies? I mean, maybe that would explain it.
You would think, because they've got this industrial strength cleaner called Decon 7. It's seriously, this is heavy duty industrial strength cleaner. And they are cleaning their churches like 4 or 5 times a day with this stuff, to the point that staff have passed out. I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. And this is all demanded by Miscavige because he's so paranoid about this COVID stuff. So the church has been like on really shaky ground for the last 2 years. And now he comes out with more bullshit at these events. Classically speaking, these events were held multiple times per year, and they were another way to get all the Scientologists on the same page, keep the conditioning going, give them enough good news that was really just exaggerations and hyperbole and lies about Scientology's expansion that they would keep going, exactly as it said in the description of this point on Euphoria, is those events were designed to do that too. They haven't had these events in a couple of years. The conditioning's been wearing off. Seriously. And now these protocols were so abusive to the membership that they just could not put up with it. And so there's this little kind of semi-revolt going on right now because of this. And he comes out and tries to do the Euphoria induction again like he was doing before, but he failed miserably. And I'm just
that's interesting
for it. I'm like, I got my popcorn. Not how this is happening, right? I'm like, I'm stunned right now how badly Miscavige is bungling this whole thing. So yes, this is a key part of Scientology's process, and it is severe because of the auditing. But it's interesting to me how it's failing on the PR front, even internally within Scientology right now. So we'll see. We'll see if he can, if he can figure it out and salvage it. But right now, he's running it off a cliff, and like I said, I'm here for it. So.
Well, you can imagine, like, so if you're watching this and you're not quite sure how to understand what we mean by Euphoria induction, when we're talking about it in this group social setting, if you've ever been to a pep rally for a sports team or for your high school, things where you're in an environment with a bunch of other people and you're all cheering for your side, your team, there's an energy in the air that we're kind of programmed to kind of feel in our psychology, and it can inspire you, it can uplift you, it can give you a sense of meaning and purpose that just expands you and binds you to this group of people that you're identifying heavily with. And so, Chris is talking about these rallies that are regularly in the past have been held that serve to infuse more of that energy and binding into the membership. So if you can think of situations where that has happened in your own group, that's the kind of the thing that we're talking about. Yeah. So Chris, in your experience then, what are you going to rate Euphoria induction as it plays out in Scientology?
Absolutely severe. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you've alluded to this one. No honorable exit. In the minds of leaders and members, there are no honorable or valid reasons to leave the organization, and those who leave are denigrated or demonized.
Correct. Yeah. When you offer yourself as the ultimate in good, and here's a direct quote, right? Scientology is the most ethical group on the planet, right? L. Ron Hubbard. Then of course leaving is the ultimate sin. It's not a turn the other cheek religion. It is not a do as you will. It is not you do your thing, we'll do our thing. That is not the Scientology attitude. And I literally read earlier here the reason why from Keeping Scientology Working, right? I read from Hubbard's words directly. So that's what I'm talking about here.
All right. Well, that's pretty straightforward then. Severe. And it's interesting when you contrast that with groups that don't have this element of control. You just ask yourself, well, what happens if I decide that, it doesn't work for me, I don't want it? Can you leave with your dignity intact? Or is there always going to be this messaging that you weren't good enough, there was something flawed in you, and so you now have to go through the rest of your life without guilt and shame? Just contrast those different ways of leaving a group and ask yourself if you're free to leave. And that's one way to look at this index when you're doing your own assessment. Yeah. All right. Okay, now the double bind. This one is hard to wrap your brain around. And most of the researchers that have looked at this, if you look at Robert Lifton, at John Jalelich, at Steve Hassan, all of them kind of approach this and try to explain it in different ways. And it shows up in different manifestations in different groups. I've described it here as it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. The member is put in a catch-22 type situation. They are induced either to comply with the group and betray themselves, or to dissent and thereby be condemned by the group. There's no way to keep yourself intact in groups that impose this on its members.
That is right. This is actually a discovery of an anthropologist named Robert Bateson, or sorry, Gregory Bateson. And he died in 1980. Really, really amazing guy. And his and amongst the many things that he did in his life, which, you know, some good, some bad, but this was particularly good. Hitting on this, and this was a proposed answer or causative element for psychosis. What causes psychosis? Why do people like have psychotic episodes or psychotic breaks? And this is a perfectly valid explanation as to why, is because they are trapped in a double bind where, you know, one thing is true and another thing is true, and they oppose one another. They are contradictory. They cannot both be true. And yet the person has to act and contemplate them as though they are. And that will make you crazy, depending on the power and influence of those ideas. It could just be a stupid, simple thing that you laugh off. You just, you know, catch-22, haha, that rule doesn't make sense with that rule. That's stupid, haha. So you have the power and ability to see past a double bind and recognize it for what it is. But if those truths, if these ideas are important to you or important to the group or are must-be truths, they have to be true for your existence to have meaning or importance or significance, then they can catch you up. You can't see them for what they are, and you are trapped in them. And Scientology is rife with double binds. They are all over the place. I'll give you an example. Scientology has a piece of information that says that communication is the universal solvent. With communication, you can solve any problem. You can talk it out. You can work it out. Through communication alone, you can deal with any social situation, no matter how rough it is, and you can sort stuff out. Well, that's a good thing. That makes some sense. But then it's juxtaposed with, you must not communicate with any suppressive person, and you must not ever communicate with anybody who's critical of Scientology, and you must not ever read, look at, or in any way digest information critical of Scientology, because it will upset you and threaten your spiritual freedom and immortality. How do these two things make any damn sense, right? They don't. They're self-contradictory. They cannot both be true. And yet in Scientology, both of these things are held up as axiomatically true. And that creates some pretty crazy making behavior in Scientologists, where they will disconnect from, shun their mother, their grandmother, their kids, right? Families get broken up on routinely over this kind of thing. I'm in touch with people right now who are in the Scientology world who are like, yeah, I'm kind of mentally getting out, but my husband, my wife, my kids are still in the headspace, and this is a real threat to my existence, because I could lose my family, I could lose my very progeny, right? Because of Scientology's demands that they not communicate. And yet in the creed of the Church of Scientology, it specifically states that all men have the right to, inalienable right, to think freely, talk freely, write freely their own opinions, and counter or utter or write upon the opinions of others. That's right in the creed of the church. And yet here's this double bind of, you must not communicate, you must not think about, you must not act in any way to, look at any of this criticism. So, that's a pretty key double bind, and it's just one of literally about 50 or 75 examples that I've spotted in Scientology, right? So,
yeah, you've mentioned a few just in the course of this conversation leading up to this, and it always reminds me of, I think, the very clear and prescient idea that George Orwell had of doublethink in the novel 1984, where it was this capacity for people to hold two contradictory ideas. But what it ended up doing, as you saw in the conclusion of the book, is basically the fact that people were compelled to accept these contradictory ideas meant that they had to surrender their ability to know anything and hand over their judgment and their cognition to the powers that be, so that if they said that 2 + 2 = 5, then they accept it. And if they say later that 2 + 2 = 4, they accept it, because they've just realized they can't make sense of these contradictory things. There must be some more sophisticated, higher level of awareness that can make sense of it all. And it serves to that crazy making process that you talked about. So you've given some great examples of this. How are we going to rate it?
Severe. Again, these points we've been covering, these last few that we've been covering, have every one of them been foundational to Scientology's control set, right? This is how Scientology works.
All right, here we go again. Milieu control. Information and environment are tightly controlled. Gossip, questioning, and criticism is tightly regulated, as is access to outside information, especially that which may raise doubts or be critical of the group.
Yeah, as gone over, right? Scientology's milieu control is severe.
Okay.
It's built into the DNA of Scientology to do this, which is why I'm going to rate it as severe. It's always there. You're never out of the milieu control of Scientology. You cannot just go in and out of Scientology and they're just going to accept that, right? They're constantly working on you to be in the group and be part of it. The time thing that we talked about earlier, for example, right? You got to be here 15 hours minimum, right? Every week. This kind of thing, right? This got so bad. Hey, check this out. During the COVID thing, I mentioned the COVID protocols. They made videos for Scientologists to follow. And in the videos, they actually showed a Scientologist going to the grocery store. When you leave your house as a Scientologist right now, you are supposed to mask up and put gloves on. And when you go to the grocery store, not just to go to the church, this is just if you leave your house. Go to the grocery store, you got a can or a bottle of that Decon 7 with you, and everything you pick up from the shelves, you're supposed to spray it first before you pick it up.
So you're exposing the public?
Yes.
Like, maybe I want this can of Spam. Nah.
Yeah. Before you pick it up, you are expected to spray it down. Right? This was in the videos and in the written book that they handed out to all Scientologists. They called them in, got to watch this video, you got to do this. And this was a bridge too far. In the Sea Org, they can get away with controlling people this closely, but the public Scientologists were not used to that
level of control.
Right? And they were just like, fuck that, or I'm not doing that. And it was too much, right? And this is the kind of thing we talk about with milieu control, is you're controlling every aspect of the person's life. So with the Sea Org, with the staff, it's absolutely in the severe band. And look at what happens when they try to do that with the public. They're rebelling. So.
I think particularly in the times that you've mentioned how it's forbidden to even read anything critical of the group. And you've mentioned before how, as outsiders, we always think, oh, we can go to any Scientologist and start to make fun of Xenu and they'll get it. Whereas you pointed out, no, most of the people don't know anything about that doctrine because the information they have access to is so tightly controlled that they don't even know that that's part of their own religion. And you're going to end up making a fool of yourself or alienating yourself from someone that you otherwise might be able to connect with.
Correct.
And that's just a symptom of that milieu control. So we'll put that in as severe.
Yeah.
And move on to confession. The individual surrenders to leaders through confession, which reduces privacy and boundaries. Successful purification can grant temporary relief from guilt, which increases trust and dedication. Members are motivated to obey to avoid confession, and confessed sins may be weaponized against members who doubt or stray.
Yeah, again, severe. This was actually the subject of my master's thesis and my research was the confession culture of Scientology. And the confessionals, the actual labeled confessionals or security checks that they do. And I broke that all down and actually researched that to a pretty detailed degree. So this is severe in Scientology. This is really, this is how they leverage that guilt and shame, is they do it through confessionals and through this security checking. And again, this is under the framework of their auditing. So it's a locked room. What you have to say other than confessing, anything else you have to say about the process is really nobody cares. You're expected to comply. And the e-meter and the auditor are believed over you. So, so if you're saying, I didn't steal the apple, and the e-meter is sitting there going, you stole the apple, and the auditor is going, yeah, you stole the apple, you ain't leaving that room until you confess to having stolen an apple. And that's how it is in that situation. It is much more analogous to a police interrogation, third degree type situation than it is to a Catholic confessional situation. These are night and day differences. So Scientology uses this confessional mechanism and has since 1960 as a very, very important part of their control operation. So this is absolutely severe in that world.
It seems like it serves not only to condemn you in the moment and make you more dependent on them for absolution or redemption, but then the aspect where it may be weaponized against you. Because that's the rumor that you always hear, is that they have some file on everyone that's all the things they've ever confessed to, and if you ever leave or depart, they'll pull out the file and they'll start smearing you with things that you've confessed to.
That's right. They did it to me. I mean, I have a hate website on me, put out by the Church of Scientology. It's got a nice video from my ex-wife trashing me, which is wonderful to see, because I really don't bear her any animosity, but she kind of hates me, and I get it. I get that interpersonal problem, right? But organizationally, in order to write all the copy, in order to write down all the awful things about me, they dived into my confessionals, right? Into the things I had confessed. Ostensibly, I was confessing in a confidential setting where this was never going to be used against me. But of course, you assume in that situation, you're never going to leave Scientology.
Right.
So, so they pull out all the times I, masturbated to porn and cheated on my wife, and they put it all down. And then they proceeded to get it all wrong, which I thought was hilarious, because I actually remember what happened, and what they wrote was not what happened. So even with the written confessionals, they still exaggerate it and throw half-truths and blatant lies into the middle of it to smear you. But the basis of their website was absolutely the confidential confessionals that I had made.
That is such an insidious and horrible. You could think of the way that confession can sometimes be used where people are wrestling with their own personal sense of failure, and that should be like a very guarded, if you're going to take a pastoral concept and say that there's some legitimacy to it, just like you would with a counselor in psychology, the wall of confidentiality that would be inherent to that is so important. This just seems like a dire violation of that type of confidentiality.
Very much.
All right.
So. Yeah.
So what do you think?
Oh, severe. Absolutely. This is foundational to their control.
Okay. Next, unaccountable leadership. The dealings of the leadership are kept secret from the members. Institutional financial records, private teachings, relevant business and social relationships of the leaders are hidden from the view of the members, and critics of this secrecy are demonized.
Yeah, this is a fascinating point. These are really, really good breakdowns here, by the way. These are all excellent points. And again, in Scientology, I have to say severe here. I mean, they really they take this point and they run with it. And it's so blatant that even when I was still in the Sea Org for the last 10 years that I was in, I saw this happening, wondered openly about it, but nobody could really answer any of my questions because I was at this level and all the super secret stuff was up here organizationally. And I didn't have access to the upper levels. I didn't, you didn't talk about it. Everything is kind of siloed off. And so people were disappearing. Trusted executives, people who had been around since Hubbard was around, were just kind of slowly disappearing. And you'd be like, whatever happened to Ray? Whatever happened to Guillaume? Whatever happened to Mark? What happened to these guys? Crickets. Nobody knows. No issues, no written documents telling us they just weren't there anymore. You know, and this was like, where'd they go? What happened to them? Don't know.
So this may be even people who were in leadership positions who left the church. Like, you would never even know what doubts or what issues caused them to leave, because they were simply disappeared from the organization and you were given no visibility to it.
That's right. And you don't get to know anything about David Miscavige's personal life. I was actually told one time, you're not even supposed to publicly announce his whereabouts. Like, if you know where he is located physically at any moment, you can't tell anybody. That's super secret. That's security information. It would be out security to talk about that.
That's the jargon.
That's the term. It's out security.
Yeah.
So you're somehow violating these unwritten rules that appeared out of nowhere in the culture, that you're just not supposed to talk about this stuff. And you don't find out about it till you do it, and you get into trouble for it. And you're like, oh shit, I didn't know I wasn't. Well, you do now. Better not be out security again. You know, and you're like, oh my God, okay. And so you become uncertain as to what is and isn't okay to talk about in an environment like that, right? And and when you talk about unaccountable leadership, is who are the leaders? I mean, you got Miscavige, but you don't even know who the other execs are anymore, because the ones you did know have disappeared. And you don't, and then written orders and directives coming from church management are not signed with a name anymore. It's just the post title.
Oh, wow.
Right? Senior CS International. This comes from the Executive Director International. Who's that? You don't even know anymore.
What about the concept of hidden or private teachings? Because sometimes there'll be two doctrinal faces of a group, where they'll have the more palatable public teachings, and then leaders may themselves act in ways that are in violation of those public teachings, but that's because they have a private doctrine that they apply to themselves.
Yep. That's definitely true, especially in the Office of Special Affairs. There are all kinds of written issues in Scientology that have never gotten out of the church. People have no idea. There is so much stuff Hubbard wrote that has never gotten out. Nobody's ever brought it out, or it's never been successfully escaped with. And this includes upper level confidential stuff, right? So you do have dual, as you mentioned here, dual doctrines, right? Where at the public level, you're not supposed to lie. You're not supposed to tell lies when you're doing public relations, right? But then you have this other level called an acceptable truth, where you can lie as long as it's something that the receiver is willing and accepting of, right? As long as you're saying something they're willing to hear, it's all good, right? And at the lower levels, you don't think about that as a lie, but then you realize, oh no, wait a minute, you can lie. And then you find a hidden drill, a practice drill exercise you're supposed to learn how to do that teaches you how to lie. And you're like, I didn't know about that. Yeah, I didn't find out about that little happy piece of exercise until after I had left the church. I found it on the internet, right? So that's one of the things that has leaked. But there's all kinds of things I saw with my own two eyes in the church that have never gotten out, that represent that kind of dual doctrine sort of situation. So yeah, I can definitely say that exists in Scientology. I wouldn't say it's at the level of severe, but I'll definitely put it at intense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Next one is deception. Lies, omissions, and front activities cover up flaws or unusual aspects of the group, doctrine, leadership, and history. Some deceptions will be revealed later when a member is ready.
Yeah, that rubs right up against that last one we covered. Very, very much the case. And And you know, and the way you get Scientologists to agree to this crap, by the way, because people look at that or read that and go, "Well, I would never." Oh yeah, you would. We all do, right? Because you want to put the best, you want to put your best foot forward for your group, or for how you represent your group, or how the group is thought of, right? And you know, we all have groups that have dirty laundry or things that maybe we wouldn't want everybody to know about, including this happens with our own families, right? You have the front face, and then you have, you know, the public way the family is known about, and then you have the hidden knowledge, right? The things you know about grandma or Uncle Bill or something that maybe everybody shouldn't necessarily know about. So this is a regular kind of human activity that people get up to. But again, we dial it up to 11 when we're talking about groups like Scientology, where it becomes so blatant and obvious, and everybody's kind of in on some of these secrets, and everybody's not necessarily in on some other ones. And that's where I mention, for example, some of that acceptable truth stuff, or some of the other policies or doctrines that the Office of Special Affairs operates on. That is Scientology's internal sort of policing and covert operation division. And they're very mysterious. Everything they do is done behind closed doors. Not a lot of Scientologists really know a whole lot about what goes on in the Office of Special Affairs. They have their own policies from L. Ron Hubbard that say very specific and kind of crazy things. But Scientologists don't have access to those policies, so they don't even know about it. Just like everybody doesn't know about Xenu until you pay your money and you get there, right?
This is one of those items where, if you're doing your assessment for yourself and your experience with a group, just realize that your awareness of the level of deception may change over time. I've talked to somebody who was involved in a multi-level marketing group that they believed was very culty, but if you were to have them take that assessment while they were in the midst of it, they would say, no, we don't lie. But then now that they, you know, in their journey out, they discovered the degree and the types of deception, it changes their perspective on whether or not it was employed. So keep that in perspective. All right. So how are we going to rate this then? You've given a pretty strong case for it.
Oh, I'll say severe on this one. This is a real strong one. This is because this is something that's so insidious, because the membership knowingly gets involved in doing this and starts making it okay. And that's where that acceptable truth thing comes in, right? For example. Yeah. So this is definitely severe in Scientology.
Okay, sacred science. The ideology and leader have the one and only truth. Members should only seek answers in group teachings. Doctrinal logic is airtight. Leaders are above criticism, and those who question or criticize are immoral.
Yeah, you pretty much are describing Scientology there.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, okay. Absolutely. And this is expressed, by the way, not only through doctrine, but also through that e-meter. The e-meter is a device that actually symbolically really represents this in Scientology, because the e-meter is infallible. It never makes a mistake. It's only the auditor or the interpretation that can be wrong, not the e-meter itself. So this is doctrine over person as well as sacred science. It's both of these things. And this, again, was key to my research from my thesis, from my master's thesis, was breaking these points down. And the e-meter, like in an auditing session, the e-meter is hooked up to the pre-clear. He's holding the cans, right? The Scientologist is sitting there connected to this electronic device. And it's really just a needle bouncing around on a dial in response to electrical resistance that your body is manifesting. It's not a spiritual exercise at all. But this e-meter is imbued with the mythology of the e-meter in Scientology. Is the lore connected with it is it's airtight. It's all circular logic. You can't get out of it. And so the e-meter is infallible. So if it responds to a question in a session, that's it. You ain't got nothing to say about it except answer the damn question. And that sacred science aspect of Scientology is, again, foundational. Hubbard hit on this very early on, realized the power of it, and ran with it. And so that's why Scientology has an e-meter and why it's so useful to Hubbard's purposes.
Okay. All right. So we're going to give that then a severe.
Yeah, big time.
If you agree with that. All right. Spying and reporting. Members are encouraged to monitor each other and report any deviation from group teachings. Privacy is considered selfish or wrong. Members are discouraged from being alone, and pairing up of members is used to ensure accountability.
Yeah, that last bit certainly applies in the Sea Org, for sure. But I would say that this is probably at the intense level. Scientology is absolutely positively a confession and snitch culture. Members write reports, formal reports on each other all the time. Now, some Scientologists take to this more than others. Depends on your temperament. Some people are kind of private by their nature, and they want to maintain their privacy, and they don't buy into the fully into the confession culture of Scientology. But when you phrase it, and the phrasing is all about how this improves things and makes them better. So it's not framed or couched in such a way that you're spying on each other. Nobody thinks that way in Scientology. You're reporting people who are breaking the rules, damn it. That's what you're doing, right? So,
and you're doing it for their own good.
Yeah, it's exactly for their own good. And not only that, but it's policy that if you know about a rule violation, a significant rule violation in Scientology, and you don't report it, you're guilty too. Right? Silence, is consent, is culpability. So it's mandated that you report on each other. And this and people are basically pretty timid and cowardly in a group setting where there's this heavy enforcement of rules. So they want to play to get along, and so they will report on each other rather than face those potential mysterious consequences of, well, what if I don't? Right. And so that's it's that threat of, well, we can give you your eternity, but we can also take it away. So you better play by the rules. And the rules include snitching on people who are violating the rules.
You mentioned earlier how even having private thoughts or a private existence was kind of frowned upon in the context of auditing, where you had to open up every aspect of your life to this auditor. And it's almost like you're spying or reporting on yourself in that paradigm, but it seemed to be a strong component of that aspect of the practice. What do you think?
Yeah, big time. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a snitch culture. It's by design. It's set up that way by design. Hubbard set up, here's the thing. Hubbard set up in 1959, he wrote something called the HCO Manual of Justice. HCO is the Hubbard Communications Office. It's the part of the organization that deals with ethics and justice. So that Manual of Justice is where he started setting up information collection, because his idea of military intelligence and of intelligence, he fancied himself a little bit of an intelligence officer, even though he was a completely failed military officer. He claimed the secret knowledge, and he set up the framework, the structure of an intelligence operation, which is constantly pulling in data or information and then analyzing it. That's what an intelligence operation does. And that's what the Church of Scientology does to its own members. It keeps files and reports and records. Every single Scientologist has 1, 2, 3, 4 different kinds of files being kept on them at any one time. So that's kind of crazy. That's dossier stuff. That's intelligence stuff. And it's used to control the membership, keep them in line. So I have to say, this is an organizational systemic issue in Scientology. It's severe. It's absolutely severe.
All right. Yeah. Okay, mystical manipulation. This one is fun. Events and experiences are orchestrated, manipulated, or reframed to appear supernatural and to prove the leader is chosen and the doctrines are true.
Yeah, this happens a lot. This is all throughout. Mostly, I'll say intense on this one. The the way this works is really through, as it describes here, through the framing, right? If you find your keys and they're missing and you find them, well, that's your OT power. See, it's not just, oh, I misplaced my keys. It's oh, look at your OT ability. If you're trying to race toward a light and it's red and it turns green, that's your OT power at work, right?
Oh, wow.
If the weather's bad and you're thinking, boy, I really wish those clouds would go away, and they do, oh, that was you doing that, right? You did that. It, you know, a high-level Scientologists who live in Clearwater constantly take credit for moving clouds around and moving things around, right? So there's good weather in Clearwater. And never mind the days when there aren't. Those are the days the OTs were off for some reason.
Yes.
Right? I mean, they got an explanation for anything. You can write all this crap off because this is all just, you know, really guided imagination. It's really just people imagining things. But this happens all the time in Scientology. It's encouraged. They actually solicit for success stories, again, around OT, what they call OT phenomena, where high-level Scientologists who have done the Xenu and the other stuff, right? They're the super beings, and they solicit them for stories of how they exhibit their superpowers.
Oh,
and
that's
you
great.
end up with stories about found keys, traffic lights, and clouds. That's usually what you end up with. You know, or I got the job. You know, I applied for this job and I used my superpowers to get the job, and they hired me. And you're like, really? This is the expression of superpowers in Scientology? But if you actually look at it, at their promotional materials, this is the crap you dig up, you know? So, yeah. So
All
it
right.
is Scientology. Yeah.
All right. You're going to give it intense? That's what I heard?
Yep.
All right. Oh, this is interesting. Propaganda saturation. Members are compelled to consume overwhelming amounts of group-generated media. The plethora of in-group media fills the available time and mental capacity of members. Group media is propagandistic in nature, manipulative, one-sided, or deceptive.
Yeah, absolutely. Scientology has their own TV channel, Scientology TV, right?
Oh, yeah?
As well as their tremendously large website. And they're always, always, always encouraging and pushing and demanding that their members watch this stuff. I'm going to say moderate on this one, only because not all the Scientologists are really into it. So dogmatically speaking, there's a big push. And if all the Scientologists complied with that push, then they really wouldn't have any kind of life outside of Scientology, because they'd always be tunnel vision. But they don't really, honestly, they don't really all comply to that degree. And so I can't really say that part of it really connects the same way the other parts that we've talked about do. But it's not for lack of trying on the part of the church.
Okay. All right. Well, I will rank it as moderate then.
Yeah.
Okay, so black and white thinking. Broad spectrums of thought and morality become reduced to two options: good versus evil, love versus hate, weak versus strong, humble versus proud, etc.
Yep. In tech versus out tech, in ethics versus out ethics. These kind of paradigms are the words that are used in Scientology to phrase, you know, moral thinking, or a moral spectrum, or a how much are you complying with and being true to the teachings? Are you on source or are you off source? Is another big one in Scientology, right? Because remember, L. Ron Hubbard is source. So are you?
So that's if you're following his teachings or you're not, and it's all or nothing.
If you're not doing what Hubbard said, you're off source. And being off source means you're not a very good Scientologist, right? That's how these are presented. Yeah, it's severe. It's another control point.
It's the air they breathe. Okay, so This one, I think I almost want to put this one as the very first one. We've touched on different aspects of this over time, but this is really the thing that separates a lot of these groups. It allows them to have the degree of control that they have, and that is totalism. The group and or teachings has relevance to every realm of life. Every facet of life should be seen through the lens of the group, and all other systems are wrong or inadequate.
Yep. Let me see real fast. Is there one thing? Let me see if I can pull this quote up. No, it doesn't seem to be coming up quickly, but let me just, this is embodied by one simple quote, which I will share with you. Scientology is the one thing that is senior to life because it explains all of life.
That sounds like an L. Ron Hubbard quote.
That's an L. Ron Hubbard quote. Right, it's from my memory, but that's a quote from Hubbard, and that pretty much positions and answers this point, right? There's a lot of other things I could say, but I think everything else we've talked about kind of show what we're the totality of Scientology's milieu control. So I'm going to say severe on this one. This is absolutely an attitude Scientologists have, and also the keeping Scientology working thing I read from earlier. Same thing, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one. This one is interesting. Transformed identity. Members shed their old identities and assume a new identity bound to the group. It may be framed as a rebirth or metamorphosis to a higher or more desirable state of being. New names may be given or assumed, and the prior identity and association are vilified.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually in the language of Scientology reflects this in many ways. There's a lot of status happy titles that you have in Scientology. I mentioned the membership levels, for example. But even as a Scientologist, not separate from the money that you give, there are states of existence, you could say, that are reflected in Scientology through words like OT, operating Thetan, is an expression of a super being. A clear, somebody who's been cleared of all their past trauma and stress and everything. A pre-clear, somebody who is climbing up to the level of clear. And at the lowest levels, before you're even a Scientologist, Scientology's equivalency to the word muggle in the Harry Potter universe is a wog. And a wog is a word, that's a word that I use with trepidation these days because I've come to learn it has the same power as the N-word in certain cultures. It's a very, very derogatory racial epithet in Britain, in the UK. And Hubbard adopted it on purpose in the 1960s when he heard it as a term to use to describe everybody who's not a Scientologist. Oh, you're a wog. And this is the term that's used, and it's an absolutely degrading term in Scientology, but it's not the N-word. I mean, no, Scientologists aren't running around thinking they're saying that. I had no idea. I only ever heard Hubbard say it. I'm an American. I haven't been to Britain. I don't know all their slang. So it really threw me when I found that out. I was like, oh my God, shit, really? I've been saying that all these years. But here's the funny thing. Even when I was in Scientology, near the end of my time, I think the last 2 or 3 years, I got sick of that word because I thought to myself, it's so degrading. We're so mean to non-Scientologists. This is really not okay that we're so degrading of them. It just occurred to me one day. And so I started calling them muggles. I made a joke out of it, right? I was like, oh yeah, the muggles out there, the people without the magic. Everybody caught on to what I was saying right away in Scientology, right? They totally got it. And they liked it too. They thought it was better than wog, because nobody liked that word, even though we didn't know the history of it. So anyway, point is labels are important in Scientology. These words are important and they indicate status and ability level and basically worth or value. So, if you're OT, you're a high worth being. If you're a wog, you suck, right? And the only way to stop sucking is to become a Scientologist. It doesn't matter if you're a Nobel Prize winner, if you cured cancer, if you cured COVID. Nobody cares in Scientology if you're still a wog, you see.
Now,
So
there's a dimension to this, Chris, that I want to kind of ask you about. In that um, the the shedding of the old identity.
yep,
This is something where you can see groups that are so severe in this that they tell you to, basically refer to your old self as being now dead, and they give you a new name, and that new name is bound to your relationship with the group itself.
yep,
And that is a way of dissociating yourself from your family, from any society, any prior culture that you had. And it's something that carries a power that I think may even be deeper than a title or a role within a ladder or hierarchy.
that's right.
And I haven't heard, like, there are groups where the new name, and I think it's most like the big red flag is if you're given a new name, because that just kind of detaches you from a family of origin. Is there anything that is that strong or powerful in the way that Scientology deals with identity?
Well, yeah, there is. And that is the disassociation factor we mentioned earlier about how you are not your body.
Okay.
Your identity in Scientology is predicated on your spiritual experiences, not your body.
And by the same token, that kind of takes away the connection that you might have familially to your parents. If you're seen as this disembodied bit of energy or whatever, then you're not really the children of your parents or anything like that. They were just caretakers until you found yourself.
Exactly. That's one of the ways they justify the disconnection, right? Your grandmother, your kids, that's just a body connection. That doesn't really mean anything in the long term. You've had trillions of lives with trillions of mothers. Fuck this lady if she's giving you shit about Scientology, right? Pardon my French, but that's kind of how they talk once you get into the behind closed doors, in Scientology. So the identity thing with identifying you as a spiritual entity or a being called a thetan is really important because this is the number one way that they justify or rationalize child abuse in Scientology. Is children are just adults, thetans, in little bodies. They've lived all the past lives you have, buddy. They've got all that knowledge and experience in them. They just got a little body that they're growing right now. So you can treat them like adults. They will respond as adults because they're just a thetan in a little body. So it doesn't.
So this is justifications that have come out as being part of adults grooming and abusing children.
Having sex with 14-year-olds, trying to marry 15-year-olds in the Sea Org, saw it all the time. All the time, right? The child abuse that runs rampant through Scientology runs on the back of this thought that they are just adults, spirits in little bodies. So this is actually like kind of important in Scientology, this identification part. And the transformed identity is transforming you into a spiritual entity more so than a, fixed identity. You know what I mean? Like it's not
like a human biological entity. And the thing is that when they do transform your self-conception of yourself, well, suddenly the rules that you play by in the world are the rules set forth by L. Ron Hubbard and the organization. Those are the rules that govern the Thetans.
That's right.
Versus like society and its rules, which govern, human bodies or things like that. And it's so fascinating to see how it's the doctrine, the technology, or the groundwork that's laid so that they see themselves as Thetans rather than as human beings. So you can look at any of these totalistic groups that captures people's identities, and many of them transform your concept of yourself as a human into a future god or a potential god or something that is other than human. And it's a way of just subverting your self identity as a human even, and then in your context is in family and society, so that they've got all of that in their control.
That's right.
And it sounds like
it's a way to sever all the other ties, right?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
And let's be clear that this has a this has the effect of creating a group of people in Scientology who care very little about your skin color or your gender. They really don't care if you're a man or a woman, if you're black, white, red, or brown. not the most important thing about you, right? Sounds like a net positive until you realize that what they're doing is they're substituting all of those factors of your identity, which are valid parts of your identity, by the way, of course, and they just ignore all that, say it's not important, and your only real value and importance is as a spiritual entity. So
that's a good point.
Unfortunately opens the door to a lot more abuse than it does actually help things. You know, you'd think that kind of attitude could be used in a constructive manner to, you know, increase tolerance and compassion and understanding for others. And at a surface level, that's what most public Scientologists kind of think, and they stop thinking at that level. But they don't think about the divisive, you know, separateness and the black and white thinking that is imposed on them by the WOG versus OT labeling and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We are at the 2 hours and 50-minute mark, and I've kept you a long time. So if you need to take a break and, you know, use the facilities or anything at any point, I want to give you a chance to do that. But we can go on to our next one.
Well, how far along are we? I'm curious, because
I think we're approaching the end. This is
okay. Let's power through.
All right. Okay, you've alluded to this before. Doctrine over self. The individual is subordinate to the group, leader, and teachings. When personal desires, goals, and values conflict with group values, they're considered selfish or immoral.
Yeah, absolutely. This is no question about it. This is severe in Scientology. Again, this was one of the 2 points that emerged from my research on Hubbard's lectures that he pushes constantly in his words, in phrases, and the way he talks to Scientologists, is he literally creates an artificial framework of doctrine over self and enforces it constantly and very subliminally, I'll say, right? In very underhanded, non-obvious ways. That's the trick to this stuff, is that it's done, it's delivered to people, and it's couched in terms that are not obvious. But it's there. It's totally there, and it's really, again, kind of built into the DNA of Scientology. So,
and again, if you want to ask yourself, is this happening in my group? Just ask yourself, what happens if there's a conflict between your judgment, your conscience, and what the group teaches? And if expectation is that you must then supplant your own judgment, your own conscience with the group doctrine, and it doesn't matter how in conflict that is, that would be a red flag that this is a strong component of this particular tactic.
That's right.
All right. What are we going to grade it as?
Severe.
All right.
Yeah. Very powerful.
Okay. Totalist reframing. Situations, questions, thoughts, or feelings are reinterpreted in a way that suits the goals of the organization. This is used to continually prove the ideology, to correct, to squelch doubts, and to silence outsiders.
Yeah. I'll tell you the simplicity, the very, very basic, simple way that this is most powerfully done in Scientology. If Scientology didn't work, it's because you didn't do it right. And when you think about that and the consequences and ramifications of that statement as an absolute truth, there are no exceptions to that rule, then you will inevitably end up exactly at that point. And that
so what you're saying is if anything goes wrong, they're going to rationalize it in whatever way is necessary in order to maintain the rock solid integrity of the organization and its teachings, and blame or throw anything and everything else under the bus. The principle that is foundation is that it always works in favor of the group. Correct. No criticism is legitimate. No other rational explanation could account for it.
Correct.
All right. So that sounds pretty severe. What are you going to do?
Yeah, it's very, very strong in that group.
Okay. Emotion over intellect. Emotion is emphasized as the preferred decision-making tool. The value of using reason is downplayed. Doctrines are frequently taught in emotional contexts, such as through stories told in tearful or gentle tones.
I'm going to grade this one as moderate in Scientology. It's absolutely there, but it's really very, very, very subtle. It's always sort of a trick presentation to you, because Scientologists pride themselves on their knowledge and scientific basis of Scientology and the fact that it's very rational. It makes a lot of sense. It's all calculated and figured out, and it was discovered. It's not just Hubbard's musings on life, it's discovered scientific truth. So they have a sort of a fixed view about that. I mean, the bottom line is that it is all faith-based, but they don't think about it that way. And that's why I have to say that this comes across as moderate in Scientology, because it's not, they don't think that that's what's going on, that it's all emotion-based. I mean, at the end of the day, it is, but, you know, it doesn't.
And that's where
that way.
The difference may be, it sounds like you're saying that they do say that rationality, logic, and argument and science is the way that we discover truth. It's just that they manipulate the mechanisms of that in order to maintain their truth in a closed system of logic. And that's different from another organization who may say, well, what do you feel in your heart? We know that your senses and your mind can trick you, but it's really what you feel in your heart. It's the burning in the bosom or the sense of whatever it is. That's what tells you what real truth is. And so those are kind of two different ways. And it's sounding like it's much more a rational, intellectual type of way, even if it's been subverted with the ideology.
In a nutshell, that's basically true. You get a lot of emotional riling up, the love bombing, that kind of stuff during the sales. When they sit down with what's called the registrar, the reg, and you're going to do what's called a reg cycle. They don't call it a sales talk. They got reframings for everything, right? And in this case, you're going to get the reg cycle, right? And so the reg is going to sit there and pump you up on your emotional wins, the euphoria, you know, they're going to work you over on that basis. But even when they're doing that, they're using language and concepts that appear to be based on rational scientific discoveries. They are not. It is all pseudoscientific garbage. But, you know, this is how they talk to one another. So,
all right. So did I hear you say moderate on this one?
Yeah, I'll say moderate on that.
Okay. Loaded language. Existing words are loaded with new meaning. New words are added. Other words are banned or dropped from usage. This affects the ability to think as well as the ability to communicate comfortably with those outside of the group.
Yeah, no doubt. Absolutely severe. Scientology is one of the worst of cults when it comes to loaded language. I mean, I can really say that like with authority. Like, I know that to be true.
When I first started listening to you, there were so many acronyms just being thrown at me. I'm like, what does all this mean? And it's just taken listening to more and more of you to see some of those explanations.
Oh yeah, no, you got dictionaries, published dictionaries in Scientology that are like this thick. I'll have to bring one in from my garage sometime because there's two of them, and they're both big, and they were put together in the 70s based on Hubbard's work. They draw definitions for terms that Hubbard has redefined in his lectures or in his writings for all kinds of regular English words as well as Scientologies, very specialized language that only exists inside the world of Scientology. So through redefinition and through, imaginative use of language, Hubbard has created whole pathways of thinking about how life works that are again, are just pseudoscientific garbage. And yet, because the language sounds scientific and rational and discovered and all of this, Scientologists give it a lot more credibility than they should. And it's such an integrated system that evolved over decades that you're like, well, all of this can't be bullshit. I mean, look at all this stuff. Look at all these issues, all these books, all these lectures. You're like, there's no way somebody could have just made all this up. And I'm sorry, but that's exactly what happened, and that's one of the reasons people buy into it, is because they're just kind of credulous. They're just like, well, no way somebody could have. Yeah.
Complexity does not equal legitimacy.
Exactly. Yeah. So loaded language is a tremendously large component of Scientology. It's absolutely severe.
All right. I'm going to give it severe.
Yeah.
Thought-terminating cliches,
Oh,
short phrases, pat answers, metaphors, and emotional reactions are pre-established to frame doubts. Doubts and questions are automatically shut down in this way.
yep. Again, a powerful technique. There are hundreds of thought-stopping cliches in Scientology. I could not even begin to write. I mean, there's hundreds of them. What would Ron do? Right? The
Yep.
thinking is done. You don't have to think. Just do what Ron would do. Right? Your PTS, you're an SP, you're, stop with your joking and degrading. These are all pat phrases in Scientology to shut down and stop the thinking from happening. And there are many, many, many of these in Scientology. Pat solutions to complex problems that defy any rationality. They're not going to solve anything, but they get you to stop thinking about it.
And they're infused with loaded language because you may hear somebody outside who's not saturated in the culture may hear something like what you just described, and it's just common words strung together, 2 or 3 words, and they're like, what's the big deal about that? But if you know that these words came from L. Ron Hubbard in a particular context to address a particular thing, and that it's you repeat it all the time to shut down doubts or dissent, then it's much more impactful to people inside of the group, and that's what these thought-terminating cliches are for.
You got
all
it.
right, so what are we going to rate it as?
Severe. Oh, they are all over the place. I did a whole video on them just on that topic one time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Identification and example. Those who behave correctly or incorrectly are used as examples. Suggested behavior can be inferred from these stories without direct commandment. Stories are told which may be reframed or blatantly untrue to demonstrate consequences. Now, you've already given us an example of your employment of, if you leave Scientology, if you don't go now that you have this information, you may end up dead like this other guy who refused. How common or how present is that theme in the way that Scientology operates?
I'd say it is. I'm going to say it's moderate in Scientology. It's there. It's absolutely there. But it's not as common as a lot of these other mechanisms that we've covered. I'll give you an example of a story that occurred to me from what you said here was you get these stories, these rumors about Miscavige and how he handles or treats people who are off the rails, right? How he runs into people and corrects them in some smarmy or snarky or authoritative way that we all go, ooh, that's so cool that he did that, right? He really showed that guy, or really put that guy in his place or whatever. And you'll get these kind of things. And I'm pretty sure in retrospect that Miscavige is the one who started these rumors because it makes him look like a badass, right? But it was just every, maybe once a year or something you'd hear about this stuff. It wasn't like a common thing. So I'll say moderate.
All right. Let's rank it as moderate and go to our next issue. Us versus them thinking. Outsiders, ex-members, and critics are dehumanized and labeled as evil, apostate, vicious, hateful, prideful, blinded, deceived, etc. A persecution complex may exist whereby reasonable criticism is always reframed as an attack.
Yeah. I think the use of the word apostate to describe ex-members came out of Scientology. Certainly the academics who were writing Scientology Apologia were using that term often. It's that was the basis of our show, right? The three apostates.
The three apostates.
I pulled that from Scientology criticism of me and other critics of Scientology, is that's what they call us, as apostates. This bad, nasty word, right, for somebody who's just given up on a religion. So yeah, this is absolutely, language is used to demonize anyone who's critical of Scientology. They're SPs, they are psychotic, they're anti-Scientology, they're guilty, they have guilty consciences, and they have axes to grind, and that's the only reason. They're making money. I love that one, right? I'm like, believe me, cult criticism is the last place you're going to make money. Nobody's paying for us to do this stuff, right? I am entirely fan funded. Otherwise, I would never be able to do what I do. So so this idea that that we're all making millions off of big pharma, and psychiatry funding us. I'm like, where's my big checks, you know? But this was a constant refrain in Scientology, and we believed it. When I was in, you know, when the anonymous protests were happening, I mentioned earlier, we were convinced that those kids were making big bucks from big pharma that was paying them to march around outside our churches. And we really thought that was true. I was so in a delusional headspace that I really thought that's how the world worked. So absolutely, I say this is absolutely severe in Scientology.
Yeah. And it kind of goes along with this is that there's an inherent kind of almost existential conflict that's always ongoing that produces both the persecution complex and, you know, it's kind of like this victimization, saintly, innocent thing that you can always frame yourself as with the other person as the bad guy. So it sounds like that's part of it. All right. So I will put severe for that. This is our last one. We reached the end.
All
okay.
Right. Did it.
Dispensation of existence. The individual's literal or figurative existence is threatened as a consequence for impurity, doubt, or leaving the group, life, the eternal soul, self-esteem, or a sense of being good, and one's identity hang in the balance.
Yeah, this is absolutely severe in Scientology, and I'll tell you the most powerful way that this is expressed across the boards in Scientology. That every Scientologist knows this phrase and is terrified of this, and that is losing their eternity. You don't want to lose your eternity, but if you leave, you're going to lose your eternity. But if you get declared, that means you lose your eternity. Like this is the absolute fear of Scientology. Scientologists is that they will not have this opportunity to go across the bridge, to get to OTA, to free themselves from the prison that is life on planet Earth and life in the material world. This is their one shot to get the fuck out. And, you know, if they waste it, if they lose it, if the church takes it away from them, then that threatens their eternity. And it's a thought-terminating cliche as well, but it is very much this point. And it's severe. This is life or death for Scientologists. This is the most threatening thing you can do is take away Scientology from them. And by doing so, you threaten their very existence as an immortal spiritual being.
All right. That sounds pretty severe.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to rank that as severe, and then we're going to look at our grid, see if we missed anything. Everything is dark green. I think we are ready for our score.
Yeah, let's check it. What do we got?
So let's see how we did.
Gee, I wonder.
What did you predict?
I predicted. Right. I thought I said 8. Did I say 8 or 9?
You did, yeah. Okay, so of the potential highest score was 80. You scored a 74, which equivalent to 93% on the assessment. And it was fairly equal in controlling every aspect of life: behavior, thought, emotion, and information. You can see the percentage of all of these. Let's see here. Yeah, so this is now the assessment score that if you had the link, you could share with people. I'm in stage 1 of this project now where I'm getting scores from different people, but eventually I'll be able to produce aggregate scores, and I'll be able to say, you know, the average score of somebody who's a former Scientologist who had mostly negative experiences will be this. And so other people can kind of compare themselves with that, and that'll be the goal. But I think just the process of going through and methodically thinking about each of these different tactics and mining your experience to be able to assess it in a little bit more direct and explicit terms is just an education in and of itself. I feel like I understand the degree that Scientology had control over your life a lot better just listening to you.
Yeah.
And what's your experience having gone through this exercise now? What advice would you give to others, or what reflections do you have on it?
I thought this was interesting. I actually am going to get you to send me that link because I'm going to share that with my viewers. I think that I'm actually going to link to it on my blog too, because I've had for a very long time, almost from the very get-go, I've had a list that was put together by Drs. Janja Lalich and Michael Angioni about destructive cult characteristics, right? And it's like 12 different characteristics that you could use as a semi-diagnostic kind of assessment for whether a group is culty or not. And it served me very, very well. And I'm going to continue to use it and have it posted on my blog. But this goes into even more detail and goes, kind of point by point by point, broke it down into 40 points. I really like that. There's a lot there. And I found that to be a very useful assessment. I want to share that with people.
All right. Well, I'm going to invite you, if you want to use this tool, you can go back through the assessment. And if you get out of the carousel mode and do it, as soon as you hit a ranking, a little icon will show up on each one. And if you want to write an example of how you experienced that thing, then it actually saves it. And on this result page, if you subsequently do it, then it'll have, for every point, it'll have a written description of how you experienced it. And that becomes an even richer resource for you to be able to share your personal experience with that. And in the future, I'll be able to add some other contextual information for it, but that's coming down the line. So listen, Chris, I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your day to go along with this. And we have an opportunity to take calls, but this is just, I've taken such amount of time. I don't want to extend it any further. And when we get you back, perhaps we'll have you interface with the audience a little bit more.
Yeah.
So
great.
We will see you again in the future if we're lucky, and maybe the three apostates will show up again with a slightly different rebrand.
Yeah.
Okay, well, until next time then, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.